I used to think the scariest things in the forest were the ones with claws or teeth. You know, the bears, the mountain lions, the wolves that emerge from the darkness with eyes like amber lanterns. But after 12 years as a park ranger, patrolling the silent corridors of ancient wilderness, I can tell you something else. The scariest things don't make noise. They don't leave tracks in the soft earth or disturb leaves. And sometimes they don't even seem to want to leave at all. We're trained for emergencies. Search and rescue operations, hikers gone missing for days in the labyrinthine trail system, even dealing with the occasional unhinged squatter whose decided civilization has nothing left to offer. But nothing in that comprehensive training covered what I encountered during my rotation at Whispering Pines National Forest, a place where the Colorado Rockies meet something far older and more patient than stone. The locals won't even say the name of the place after dark. They call it the Morning Ground, though the official maps still show it as Sector 7, Grid Reference North 17. It started with a simple report, hastily scrawled in the campsite logbook with trembling handwriting. Odd noises near the Sorrows Rest campsite, a visitor had written, like someone crying. But the crying never stopped. Even when we moved our tent 300 yards away. Even when we stuffed our ears. It followed us through the trees like smoke. I thought it was just coyotes. The way they can mimic human voices when the moon is thin and their hunger runs deep. I wish to God it had been coyotes. Why I found that week in the shadow of Desolation Ridge still keeps me up at night, staring at my bedroom ceiling until dawn bleeds through the curtains. And I don't care if you think I'm crazy. I've told my supervisors at headquarters in Denver. I filed my incident reports in triplicate, each one stamped and filed away in some basement cabinet where uncomfortable truths go to die. But the thing I saw out there, moving between the sentinel pines like it owned every square inch of that cursed ground. It didn't care about rules. It didn't care about logic or rational explanation. And it sure as hell didn't care that I was wearing a badge and carrying enough firepower to drop a charging elk. This is my story. Every word of it happened exactly as I'm telling you. And if you ever go camping alone, especially in the off-season when the tourist crowds have fled and the forest reclaims its ancient silence, make sure you're the only one who sets up a tent in that wilderness. Because the man I found near the place they call Sorrow's Rest, he never left. And now neither do the others. It was late October, technically past peak season when the aspens turn gold and the first snow dusts the high peaks, but we still had the occasional hiker or backwoods camper brave enough to face the bone-deep cold that settles into the valleys like a living thing. I was assigned to do a perimeter sweep along the Widow's Walk Ridge, a treacherous path that follows the spine of the mountain close to the abandoned Keeper's Tower, and check the trail logs that serve as our only communication with the scattered wilderness beyond cell phone range. Campers leave notes in those weatherproof boxes, sometimes cute messages for future visitors, sometimes complaints about broken trail markers, sometimes warnings about aggressive wildlife or washed-out bridges. Most of the time, they're routine. Boring, even. But when I opened the log station near trail marker 12, positioned at the crossroads where the morning path splits toward the deeper wilderness, I found something that made my skin crawl. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, written in blue ink that had run slightly, as if the writer's hands had been damp with sweat or fear. Sorrow's Rest campsite. Heard someone crying late last night. Sounded close, like right outside the tent wall. Went on for hours. My wife couldn't sleep. We searched with flashlights at dawn. No one was there. No footprints. No disturbed ground. But I swear I could still hear it echoing through the trees even as we packed up. The sound followed us for 3 miles down the trail. Could have been a prank. Could have been an animal. Maybe an injured fox or a sick owl. The wilderness plays tricks on tired minds and overworked imaginations. But something about those words, the raw terror bleeding through the inadequate ink, bugged me like a splinter under the skin. I checked the roster back at the station, flipping through pages of signatures and permit numbers. No campers had officially signed into that area since the previous Tuesday, nearly a week ago. The last entry was a family from Kansas who'd registered for 3 days at Pine Meadow, a full 5 miles south of Sorrow's Rest. Odd. More than odd. I made a mental note to swing by the campsite on my loop back, though every instinct I developed over 12 years in these mountains was screaming at me to file the report and forget about it. The air was thin and sharp as I hiked deeper into the forest, typical for that elevation where the trees grow sparse and twisted. October at 8,000 feet carries a bite that cuts through even the best gear. As I followed the winding trail toward the heart of the wilderness, I noticed something profoundly wrong. The birds were absent. Not just quiet, completely gone. Even the ever-present squirrels that usually chattered and scrambled through the branches had vanished like smoke. I've been in dead silent woods before, usually just before a massive storm rolls in, or when a mountain lion establishes territory and every living thing with sense goes to ground. But this was different. This was unnatural. It wasn't the silence of nature holding its breath in anticipation. It was the silence of absence, of abandonment. Like even the ancient trees were trying not to draw attention to themselves, holding their branches motionless despite the constant wind that should have been whispering through their needles. And I was walking right into the heart of it, my boots crunching on frost-brittle leaves that sounded obscenely loud in the preternatural quiet. The trail to Sorrow's Rest diverged from the main path about 2 miles past the log station, marked only by a small wooden sign that had been weathered nearly blank by decades of harsh mountain weather. I'd been down this way before, but never alone, never in this suffocating silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like deep water. As I descended into the valley where the campsite waited, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, and I pulled my jacket tighter. The pines here grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural cathedral of shadow and whispered secrets. And somewhere ahead carried on air so still it felt solid. I heard it. Crying. Faint. Distant. But definitely human. Sorrow's Rest sat in a natural alcove carved from the mountainside by some long-dead glacier, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that must have been growing when the first European explorers stumbled through these peaks. Beautiful in its isolation, haunting in its perfection, it was usually one of our most popular backcountry sites during peak season. Experienced campers sought it out for the spectacular view it offered of the Desolation Valley below, where mist perpetually clung to the rocky outcroppings like the ghosts of ancient seas. But now, in the grip of late October's frozen fingers, it looked untouched by human presence, except for one thing that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. A tent. A green, single-man dome tent, zipped up tight against the world. The fabric was taut, new-looking, as if it had been pitched with military precision. Problem was, it hadn't been there during my last patrol sweep a week ago, and no one had signed in to camp here. I approached slowly, every sense heightened to the point of pain. The forest around me maintained its unnatural silence, but now it felt expectant, as if the very trees were leaning in to watch what would happen next. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the amphitheater of stone and wood. "Park ranger." "Anyone inside?" No answer. The tent remained perfectly still, not even the slight movement you'd expect from someone shifting inside or turning in their sleep. I tapped the canvas wall with my knuckles. The material was cold to the touch, not just cool from the mountain air, but cold like something that had been sitting in shadow for hours, maybe days. Like something that had never known warmth. Then something moved. Not inside the tent, around it. Through the gaps between the tree trunks. I froze, every muscle in my body suddenly rigid with primal alarm. My hand instinctively moved to the radio clipped to my belt, fingers finding the familiar weight of it. There was no wind. The air hung motionless as trapped breath. But a faint sound drifted through the cathedral of trunks, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Crying. Not loud. Not the frantic sobbing of someone in immediate distress. Just persistent. Childlike. The sound of someone who had been weeping for so long they'd forgotten why they started, forgotten everything except the act itself. It wasn't coming from the tent. It was coming from the forest, from the shadows between the trees, from the very ground beneath my feet. Is someone out there? I called again, louder this time, my voice cracking slightly with tension I couldn't control. This is an official park area. You need to register if you're camping here. The crying stopped, just like that, cut off as cleanly as if someone had flipped a switch. Silence collapsed over the campsite again, even heavier and more oppressive than before. It pressed against my eardrums until they ached, made my heartbeat sound like thunder in my chest. I unzipped the tent with hands that trembled despite my best efforts to stay calm. Empty. Completely, utterly empty. No sleeping bags spread across the floor. No backpack propped in the corner. No personal gear of any kind. Not even the slight depression in the ground that would indicate someone had actually slept here. The earth inside was dry, untouched, pristine, as if the tent had been pitched moments ago by invisible hands. It was like someone had set up camp just to mess with me, and then vanished into thin air. I took several steps back from the tent, scanning the tree lean with eyes that felt too wide, too exposed. The dying afternoon light filtered through the canopy in shafts of gold and amber, creating a lattice of shadow and illumination that could hide a dozen secrets. That's when I saw him. About 30 yards away, positioned perfectly in a gap between two massive pines, stood a man. He wore an old parka, military surplus from the look of it, torn at the shoulder seam and stained with something dark that could have been mud or blood or worse. His boots were caked with earth, so thick it seemed to have grown there over years of neglect. But it was his face that made my stomach drop toward my boots. Pale, dry, like paper left in the sun until it turned brittle and yellow. His skin had a waxy, translucent quality that made him look less like a living person and more like a museum exhibit of what a person used to be. He just stood there, absolutely motionless, watching me with eyes that reflected the dying light like polished stones. "Sir," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady and professional. "Are you lost? You're not supposed to be camping out here without proper registration and permits." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. Just continued staring with that unblinking, predatory focus that made every instinct I'd inherited from 10,000 generations of human ancestors scream at me to run. I started toward him, hand resting on my radio, boots crunching on the carpet of dead needles and fallen leaves. My training kicked in, approached cautiously, assessed the situation, determined if this was a lost hiker, a mentally disturbed individual, or something else entirely. 10 steps across the uneven ground. 15, my breathing shallow and controlled. 20, close enough now to see that his clothes weren't just old. They were wrong somehow, cut in a style that belonged to decades past. 25 steps, and I could smell something coming off him. Not body odor or unwashed clothing, but something else. Something like wet earth and old copper pennies. Then I rounded the massive pine he'd been standing behind, ready to make contact, ready to help or detain, or whatever the situation required. And he was gone. Simply gone, as if he'd never been there at all. I radioed base station immediately, my fingers fumbling with the controls as I tried to process what I'd just experienced. The static-filled voice of dispatch crackled through the speaker, reassuringly normal in the abnormal silence of Sorrow's Rest. "Ranger Station, this is Martinez at Sorrow's Rest. I've got a possible lost hiker situation in Sector 7. Requesting permission to extend patrol to conduct search of Grid 3A North." "Copy that, Martinez. Weather's clear, you've got daylight for another 2 hours. Keep us posted every 30 minutes. Acknowledged station." Martinez out. But even as I clipped the radio back to my belt, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not just observed, studied, evaluated. Like I was the subject of some vast patient experiment being conducted by something with all the time in the world. I spent the next 2 hours methodically combing through that section of forest, following protocols I'd practiced hundreds of times. I checked for footprints in the soft earth around stream beds and muddy patches. I searched for recent campfires, discarded trash, broken branches that might indicate someone had passed through recently. I called out regularly, listening for responses that never came. The deeper I went into the wilderness, the more profound the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of birds and small mammals anymore. It was as if the very air had thickened, muffling sound and making my own footsteps seem distant and dreamlike. And always, at the very edge of my perception, I felt eyes on me, watching from between the trees, from the shadows cast by standing stones, from places where the light couldn't quite penetrate the green darkness of the deep forest. No footprints, no recent campfires, no sign that any human being had passed through this area in weeks, maybe months. And that eerie, dry silence followed me like a living thing, pressing close against my back as if something were walking just a few steps behind me, matching my pace perfectly. When I finally returned to Sorrow's Rest, the sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. I expected to find the mysterious tent still there, waiting for me like a green accusation in the gathering twilight. The tent was gone. I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that damn tent had vanished completely. I stood in the clearing like a fool, spinning in slow circles, searching every square inch of the campsite. Nothing remained but slightly trampled grass where the tent had been pitched, and even that was already springing back to its natural state as if erasing the evidence of its own disturbance. My hands shook as I pulled out my camera, documenting the empty campsite with photographs that would later seem inadequate and unbelievable. The pictures wouldn't capture the wrongness of the place, the way the air itself felt corrupted and cold. Then came the crying again. Closer this time. Much closer. It was behind me, no more than 20 feet away, the sound of someone weeping with the desperate, hopeless intensity of the truly abandoned. I spun around, hand flying to my service weapon. There he was, 10 feet away, the man from before. Same torn parka hanging loose on his emaciated frame. Same mud-caked boots that looked like they'd been walking through graveyards for decades. But now I could see his face clearly in the dying light, and what I saw made my blood turn to liquid nitrogen in my veins. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Not even a malicious one. It was empty, hollow. Like someone who had forgotten what smiles were supposed to mean but remembered the mechanical motion of it. Like he was mimicking something he'd observed but didn't understand, the way a child might imitate adult behavior without grasping its purpose. His eyes were the worst part. They reflected the sunset like mirrors, but there was nothing behind them. No intelligence, no personality, no spark of whatever it is that makes a person human. Just emptiness stretching back into infinity. I took a step backward, my hand finding the radio again. "Sir, I need you to stop right there and identify yourself." He opened his mouth, and the crying sound came out, but his mouth didn't match the noise. The sound was wrong, fundamentally wrong. Not human. Like a recording played through broken speakers, or the sound a broken music box might make as it wound down for the final time. The crying continued to pour from his open mouth, but his lips weren't moving right. His throat wasn't working the way a human throat should work. I backed away, every rational thought in my head screaming that this was impossible, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that altitude sickness or dehydration was making me hallucinate. He took a step forward. His foot made no sound on the forest floor. No crunch of leaves, no whisper of disturbed earth. He moved like he weighed nothing at all, like he was floating just above the ground. I turned and ran. I ran like I hadn't run since high school track, my legs pumping and my lungs burning in the thin mountain air. I crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, bounded down the treacherous trail toward the lower elevations like a man possessed. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back, because I could hear him following me. Not footsteps, something else. The sound of movement without contact, a presence without substance. And underneath it all, that terrible crying continued, echoing through the trees like the voice of the forest itself mourning something that had been lost long before I was born. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed against a standing stone marked with ancient symbols that predated any human settlement in these mountains. Only then did I dare to turn around. The forest behind me was empty, silent, normal, but I knew he was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting with the infinite patience of something that had nowhere else to be. There's an old fire tower about a mile south of Sorrow's Rest, following a maintenance trail that's barely more than a deer path through the undergrowth. The Keeper's Tower, they called it in the old days, back when the Forestry Service maintained watchers in every sector of the wilderness. Abandoned for decades now, it stands as a monument to a time when people believed they could tame the wilderness through constant vigilance. The tower still stands, a skeletal framework of rusted metal and rotting wood platforms that rises nearly 100 feet above the tree line. It's been condemned for years, officially off-limits to hikers and tourists, but we rangers still use it occasionally as a reference point or emergency shelter. I'm made for it now, my boots hammering the trail in a rhythm that matched my thundering heartbeat. Every shadow between the trees seemed to conceal movement. Every whisper of wind through the branches sounded like whispered words in languages I didn't recognize. The base of the tower was wrapped in official warnings: danger, structure unsafe, do not climb. Red tape that had faded to pink fluttered from the lower rungs of the ladder, creating a barrier that was more psychological than physical. I ignored it all and began to climb. The ladder was solid enough, despite the rust and the gaps where bolts had worked loose over the years. I climbed steadily, hand over hand, focusing on the simple mechanical action of ascending rather than the growing awareness that something was wrong below me. About halfway up, I heard footsteps, fast, heavy, moving with purpose across the forest floor far below. I looked down through the framework of metal supports and saw him emerge from the tree line at the base of the tower. The man in the torn parka, moving with that uncanny silence despite the sound of footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere except where he actually was. He began to climb. I climbed faster, taking rungs 2 at a time now, my hands slipping on metal slick with decades of mountain weather. The platform at the top of the tower seemed impossibly far away, receding like a mirage as panic made my movements clumsy and desperate. Behind me, below me, the steady rhythm of his ascent continued. No huffing or puffing from the exertion. No pause to rest or adjust his grip. Just that relentless, mechanical climbing that spoke of something that didn't get tired, didn't feel pain, didn't need to breathe. I reached the observation platform and immediately scrambled through the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind me and turning the heavy iron latch that secured it. The sound echoed through the small enclosed space of the tower's cabin, a space barely large enough for one person and the ancient, dust-covered equipment that had once been used to spot forest fires across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. I pressed my back against the far wall, gasping for breath in the thin air, listening for sounds of continued pursuit. Silence. I waited, counting my heartbeats, straining to hear the sound of hands on metal rungs below me. Nothing. Maybe I'd lost him. Maybe whatever game he was playing had rules I didn't understand, boundaries he couldn't cross. I was wrong. When I turned to look out the tower's grimy windows, searching for any sign of movement in the forest below, he was already there, inside the cabin with me, standing in the corner where the shadows were deepest, as if he'd been there all along, waiting patiently for me to notice him. No sound of the trapdoor opening. No creak of floorboards under his weight. He was simply there, existing in a space like he'd materialized from the accumulated darkness of decades. Up close, in the confined space of the observation cabin, I could see details I'd missed before. His skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent in places, showing the shadow of veins and bones beneath like a medical illustration. His clothes weren't just old, they were wrong. The style belonged to the 1970s, maybe earlier, and they hung on his frame like they'd been tailored for someone with more substance, more presence in the physical world. But it was his eyes that held me frozen. They weren't reflecting light anymore. They were absorbing it, creating small black holes in his face where human expression should have been. The crying sound filled the small space again, but now I could tell it wasn't coming from him at all. It was coming from beneath us. from below the floorboards of the observation platform, from inside the tower itself. The sound rose through the metal framework like smoke, a chorus of weeping voices that seemed to come from multiple sources. Men, women, children, all crying with the same hopeless persistence I'd first heard near the campsite. I dropped through the trapdoor without thinking, my survival instincts overriding rational thought. I climbed down that ladder like my life depended on it, because it did. I didn't stop until I reached the ground, and even then I kept running. I crashed through the forest without regard for trails or direction, branches tearing at my uniform, rocks turning my ankles, the growing darkness making every step a potential disaster. I didn't stop until I reached the ATV station near the main ranger road, a small maintenance building that suddenly seemed like the most beautiful sight in the world. Concrete walls, electric lights, radio equipment that connected me to the normal world of policies and procedures and rational explanations. My lungs felt like they were tearing from the inside as I gasped for breath in the familiar safe space. I fumbled for my radio, trying to call in a report that would make sense to my supervisors back at headquarters. But what could I say? That I'd been chased through the forest by a man who moved without making sound, who appeared and disappeared like smoke, who commanded a chorus of crying voices from inside an abandoned fire tower. The man never followed me to the station. But he didn't need to. Because when I checked the campsite registry log the next morning, my hands shaking as I flipped through pages of routine entries and mundane complaints, I found his name. 4 times. The same name, written in handwriting that remained identical across decades, Thomas Keeper. Same signature, the letters formed with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to write with a fountain pen. Same campsite registration, Sorrow's Rest, solo backpacking. Same date, October 17th. Every year. For the last 30 years. But it was the address that made my blood turn to ice water. Keeper's Tower Fire Station, Sector 7, Whispering Pines National Forest. An address that hadn't existed since 1974, when the Forestry Service closed the last of the manned observation towers and switched to satellite monitoring and aircraft patrols. I asked one of the old-timer rangers about the name Thomas Keeper. Paul Hendricks had been working these mountains for 35 years, since back when rangers still rode horses on their patrols, and the radio equipment was so primitive it might as well have been smoke signals. When I mentioned the name, Paul's weathered face went pale as winter frost. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, glancing around the break room as if the walls might have ears. "You saw him." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Paul leaned in close, his eyes darting toward the windows and doors like we were being watched by invisible observers. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They call him the Echo. Been calling him that since before I started working here. Thomas Keeper was a ranger once, back in the 70s. Good man, they say. Dedicated. Maybe too dedicated." Paul stood up and walked to the coffee pot, but I could see his hand shaking as he poured himself a cup he didn't want. He was assigned to the Keeper's Tower. That's how it got its name, you understand. Not the other way around. Tom Keeper was the last man to work that station full-time, the last of the old breed who believed you could watch over every acre of wilderness if you just never blinked, never looked away. Paul sat back down, cradling the coffee cup like it might provide warmth for a chill that went deeper than skin and bone. December of 1974, worst blizzard in 50 years hit these mountains. Winds over 80 miles per hour, temperature dropped to 40 below. Every rational person in a 100-mile radius was hunkered down by a fireplace, waiting for it to pass. I waited, knowing there was more, knowing it would be worse than what I'd already heard. But Tom Keeper was up in that tower, doing his job. Radio contact went silent on December 18th. Storm lasted 3 more days. When it finally cleared enough for a rescue team to reach the tower, Paul's voice trailed off. He stared into his coffee as if he might find answers in its dark surface. They never found his body. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a weight that had nothing to do with the mountain air or the approaching winter. Search teams combed every square mile of forest for weeks. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 6 counties. Nothing. It was like Tom Keeper had just dissolved into the storm. Paul looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much and remembered too clearly. But here's the thing that doesn't get written in any official reports, doesn't get mentioned in any meetings with the bureaucrats back in Denver. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible now. People started seeing him. Campers, hikers, other rangers. Always in October. Always near what used to be his assigned patrol area. At first, folks thought maybe he'd survived somehow, gone hermit, living off the land. But Paul shook his head slowly. The sightings never changed. Same torn parka he was wearing the day he disappeared. Same face, same age, like time just stopped for him when that blizzard hit. And the crying, God, the crying. Like he's still up there in that tower, still trying to do his job, still watching over his territory. I found my voice, though it came out as a croak. What do you think happened to him? Paul was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the forest that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I think Tom Keeper loved these mountains so much he couldn't leave them. Even when he died, even when any sane soul would have moved on to whatever comes next. I think he's still up there, still trying to protect people from dangers they don't understand. He turned back to me, his eyes holding a sadness that seemed to encompass decades of accumulated knowledge. Problem is, I don't think he remembers how to be human anymore. And I don't think he understands that the people he's trying to protect are now afraid of him. I asked the question that had been burning in my throat since I'd seen those registry entries. Why doesn't the service warn people? Why aren't there signs, advisories, something? Paul laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just bitter experience and bureaucratic cynicism. Because no one believes it. Not the administrators, not the politicians who control our budget, not the tourists who pay the fees that keep this place running. Ghost stories don't look good in the annual reports. They don't help with funding requests or public relations campaigns. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest with the expression of a man who knew its secrets too well. Until they see him themselves. Until they spend a night alone in Sector 7 and wake up to find that green tent sitting there like an accusation. Until they hear that crying echoing through trees that are older than civilization and realize it's not an animal, not the wind, not their imagination. Paul turned back to me, his face serious as a funeral. And when they do, when they finally see Thomas Keeper still walking his patrol, still trying to do a job that killed him 40 years ago, he finished his coffee in one gulp and headed for the door. They stopped talking about it, because they know no one will believe them either. As he reached the doorway, Paul paused and looked back at me. Word of advice, Martinez. Request a transfer. Different sector, different forest if you can manage it. There are some things in these mountains that are better left alone. And some people. His voice trailed off, but I knew how the sentence ended. Some people never leave. So here's what I'll leave you with, and I want you to understand that every word of this is true. Not metaphorically true, not symbolically true, but literally, factually, documentably true in the way that only the deepest nightmares can be. I don't know what I saw in those woods around Sorrow's Rest. I don't know if Thomas Keeper is a ghost, or something worse, or something that exists in the spaces between what we call life and death where the normal rules don't apply. But I know he's still there. I know because I've never gone back to that campsite, never volunteered for patrols in Sector 7, never even looked in that direction when I'm working the North Tower assignments that take me within sight of Desolation Valley. I know because other rangers have started coming to me quietly after their shifts, asking if I've ever heard of someone called the Echo. They tell me stories that match mine too closely to be coincidence. The crying in the forest. The tent that appears and disappears like a mirage. The man in the torn parka who moves without sound and watches with eyes that reflect light like polished stones. I know because the campsite registry continues to show his name year after year, October 17th like clockwork. Same handwriting, same address that hasn't existed for half a century, Same signature that belongs to a man who should have been buried decades ago if there had been anything left to bury. The administration has started talking about closing Sector 7 to public camping. Environmental sensitivity, they call it in the memos. Habitat preservation for endangered species. They cite wildlife studies and soil erosion reports and visitor impact assessments. But I know the real reason. Because the reports keep coming in. Not many, most people who encounter Thomas Keeper don't file official complaints. They pack up their gear and leave the forest and never come back, carrying their stories like scars they don't want to explain. But some talk. Some write letters to the Park Service describing experiences that can't be explained by wildlife or weather or overactive imaginations. Some demand investigations, threaten lawsuits, contact local news stations that file the stories under human interest and forget about them the next day. And all their stories are the same story. The story I'm telling you now. So if you ever find yourself camping in the Colorado Rockies, in the deep wilderness where the cell phone towers can't reach and the nearest road is a day's hike through country that looks exactly the same as it did when the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge. If you're setting up your tent in a place that feels too perfect, too isolated, too much like nature designed it specifically for someone who wants to disappear from the world. And if you see a green dome tent sitting alone in a clearing surrounded by pines that whisper secrets to each other in the wind, don't investigate. Don't call out to see if anyone's inside. Don't assume it's just another camper who forgot to register at the ranger station. Just pack up your gear, no matter how long you've been hiking to get there, no matter how tired you are, no matter how perfect the campsite looks, and leave. Because some things in these ancient mountains aren't meant to be found by the living. Some people are still doing jobs that killed them decades ago. And some stories only end when the last person who could tell them finally stops talking. Thomas Keeper is still out there, still walking his eternal patrol through the morning ground, still trying to protect visitors from dangers he no longer understands, still setting up that green tent every October 17th, like a clock that can't stop ticking, like a broken record that plays the same song forever. And every year, someone new discovers that tent. Every year, someone else learns why the locals won't say the name of that place after dark. Every year, another person joins the small, silent fraternity of those who've seen the echo and lived to tell about it. Though most of us never do tell about it. Not really, not in ways that make people believe. Because we know that some truths are too heavy for most minds to carry. We know that some stories are better left untold. And we know that Thomas Keeper doesn't distinguish between the people he's trying to save and the people he's trying to save them from. In his fractured understanding of duty and protection, we're all just visitors in his territory now. All potential threats to the wilderness he died defending. All of us just camping alone in the dark, waiting for him to decide whether we deserve to leave his forest alive. The last entry I saw in the registry, dated just 2 weeks ago, was written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Heard crying all night. Saw the green tent. Saw the man. He smiled at me. I don't think I'm supposed to remember this, but I can't forget. Tell my family I love them. Tell them I tried to come home. The signature was illegible, smeared as if the writer's hands had been shaking too badly to control the pen. That camper never made it back to the ranger station. His car is still sitting in the trailhead parking lot, covered in snow now that October has turned to November. We've got search teams combing the area, but I know they won't find anything. Because some people who visit the morning ground never leave. And now there are 2 tents that appear in Sorrow's Rest every October 17th. Both green, both empty, both waiting for the next visitor who thinks they're camping alone. I used to love the quiet, the stillness of the ancient forests that blanket the whispering Ridge Mountains. The way the wind rustles through centuries-old Douglas firs, creating a symphony that few ever truly hear. The way the stars hang like scattered diamonds over the jagged black silhouettes of Devil's Backbone Ridge, untouched by the pollution of civilization below. It was peaceful. Sacred, even. But that changed the night I spent alone in Shadow Peak Watchtower. I've worked as a fire lookout ranger for 6 years in these forgotten corners of the Northwood Wilderness. The kind who sits perched like a sentinel for days at a time, scanning endless miles of emerald canopy for the telltale wisps of smoke that could spell disaster. People think it's boring. They say it must be lonely, sitting up there with nothing but trees and sky for company. Let me tell you something. Loneliness is only scary when you're not alone. That night, I learned the forest has layers, depths and shadows we never see when the sun's protective light bathes the world. Ancient depths that predate our understanding, where things move according to rules we've forgotten. And some things only rise after dark, when the boundary between our world and theirs grows thin. They don't knock. They don't announce themselves with footsteps or voices, but they watch you with an intensity that makes your skin crawl, your breath catch in your throat. And if you make eye contact, if you acknowledge their presence with even a glance, it's already too late. Shadow Peak Watchtower wasn't supposed to be in use. It was decommissioned back in 1987 after Ranger Thomas Blackwood fell to his death from the observation deck. Or jumped, according to some reports. Or was pushed, whispered others who knew the real story. No one ever figured it out. The investigation was closed quietly, the tower sealed, the trail allowed to grow over with thorny undergrowth and creeping moss. So when my supervisor said I had to rotate there just for the weekend, covering for a ranger who'd suddenly called in sick, I didn't argue. Should have, though. I wish I had. Because what I experienced in Shadow Peak Watchtower, what watched me from the bleeding pine forest below, it didn't want to be seen by human eyes. And when I saw it, when I truly saw it, it made sure I'd never forget. This is my story. My confession, if you will. And if you ever climb into a fire lookout tower and feel like the shadows outside are getting closer, like the darkness is pressing against the glass with malevolent intent, get down and never go back. Because Shadow Peak Watchtower doesn't just watch for fires. It watches for you. It started with a reassignment email that arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind of dreary, overcast day that makes you want to crawl back into bed. Temporary placement. Shadow Peak Watchtower, Friday through Monday. I blinked at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. Shadow Peak? That abandoned relic perched on Vulture's Perch Ridge? I immediately messaged my supervisor, Sarah Chen, who'd been running the district for nearly 15 years. Is Shadow Peak even safe? Thought it was condemned. She replied almost immediately, which should have been my first warning. Yep. Refurbished last year. Just a routine rotation. Take a good book and some extra batteries. She added a smiley face emoji. I should have known something was off. Sarah never used emojis. Most rangers avoided Shadow Peak Watchtower like it was cursed ground. The old-timers who'd worked these mountains before the incident had stories, whispered tales shared over campfires and in the break room when supervisors weren't around. Rumors said it was haunted by Blackwood's restless spirit. Others said it wasn't haunted in any traditional sense, just wrong. Tainted. Like the air didn't move the right way up there. Like the shadows fell at impossible angles. Like the tower existed in a pocket of space where natural laws bent and twisted. Marcus Rivera, a 20-year veteran who transferred out after spending just one night there in '95, once told me, "That place doesn't belong in our world, James. It's a wound in reality, and something's been bleeding through it for decades." I'd laughed it off then. Wish I hadn't. Still, orders were orders. I packed up my standard gear, sleeping bag, camp stove, weather radio, emergency beacon, extra water, and drove my battered Jeep down the serpentine dirt road that wound through Thornvale Canyon. The road to the Shadow Peak access trail was barely more than 2 tire ruts carved into the mountainside, flanked by towering pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of perpetual twilight. The tower sat on Vulture's Perch Ridge, a knife edge of granite that jutted out from the main mountain like an accusing finger. It was a solid 90-minute climb with a 60-pound pack, following a trail that switched back through groves of ancient hemlocks and across scree fields where loose stones clattered away into the abyss below. When I finally reached the base of Shadow Peak Watchtower, I paused, breathing hard in the thin mountain air. Even with the new support beams and fresh coat of dark green paint, clearly the refurbishment Sarah had mentioned, the structure felt wrong. Not just old, but ancient in a way that had nothing to do with when it was built. The 70-foot steel tower rose from a concrete foundation that was already cracking, weeds pushing through in patterns that looked almost deliberate. The metal stairs spiraled upward like a DNA helix, disappearing into the shadows beneath the observation cabin. It felt like the forest had grown around the tower not naturally, but defensively, as if the trees themselves were trying to hide it from view. The surrounding bleeding pine forest, so named for the red sap that oozed from the bark, pressed in close, branches scraping against the tower's legs with every breath of wind. I shook off the unease and began the long climb up. The observation cabin at the top was cramped but functional, a narrow cot pushed against one wall, a weathered logbook chained to a small desk, powerful binoculars mounted on a swivel base, and a red emergency phone that connected directly to the district office. No cell signal this deep in the mountains. No power except for the solar battery that kept the radio equipment running. Just me, the endless expanse of the bleeding pine forest, and miles upon miles of wilderness stretching to the horizon in every direction. Through the large windows, I could see the twisted spires of Demon's Crown Peak to the north, the brooding mass of Widow's Vale Mountain to the east, and far below, the dark ribbon of Sorrow Creek winding through the valley like a scar. I didn't see it yet, the thing that called this place home. But as I unpacked my gear and settled in for what I thought would be a routine weekend, I could feel it watching me from somewhere in the depths of the forest below. Waiting. The first few hours passed peacefully enough. I read a paperback thriller I'd brought along, dutifully logged wind speeds and temperature readings every hour, and watched the sunset paint the valley in shades of amber and crimson. The view from Shadow Peak was breathtaking, an endless sea of treetops rolling away toward distant peaks that glowed like molten copper in the dying light. As darkness crept across the bleeding pine forest like a rising tide, I lit my Coleman lantern and settled in with a cup of instant coffee and a freeze-dried dinner that tasted like salted cardboard. Then, around 11 p.m., I saw something that made my blood run cold. A light, flickering deep within the forest below, moving between the massive trunks of the old-growth pines. Not the steady beam of a flashlight or the warm glow of a campfire, but something else entirely, a pale, sickly luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent heartbeat. But there weren't supposed to be any hikers in the Bleeding Pine sector. The trail system had been closed for years due to unstable terrain and frequent rock slides. I grabbed the mounted binoculars and focused on the area where I'd seen the light. No trail down there. No clearing. No logical reason for anyone to be wandering through that treacherous maze of deadfall and thorny undergrowth. Just darkness. And then as I watched, the light blinked out like a candle being snuffed. I sat back, my coffee forgotten, unease crawling up my spine like ice-cold fingers. Probably just swamp gas, I told myself. Or moonlight reflecting off standing water. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. Right? Then came the tapping. 3 soft, deliberate taps that seemed to rise from the very bones of the tower itself. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my hand halfway to my coffee cup. The sound had come from directly beneath the floorboards, as if someone or something was standing on the platform below the observation cabin. But that was impossible. I would have heard footsteps on the metal stairs. The tower was 70 feet tall, for God's sake. I stomped once on the floor, hard enough to make the entire cabin shudder. Nothing. Silence stretched out like a held breath. Then, tap, tap. Slower now. More deliberate. Like whatever was down there was learning, adapting, responding to my challenge. My flashlight was in my hand before I even realized I'd grabbed it. I moved to the floor hatch that led down to the stairwell, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The metal handle was cold enough to burn my palm. I yanked the hatch open and shone my light down into the spiral of steel stairs. Empty. just shadows coiling around the support beams like living things, and the faint sound of wind whistling through the tower's framework. I slammed the hatch shut and engaged the heavy lock that I'd thought was purely decorative. That's when the whispering started. At first, I convinced myself it was just wind in the trees. The bleeding pine forest was notorious for the eerie sounds it made when air moved through its twisted branches. But as I pressed my ear to the window, straining to hear, the sounds resolved into something that made my skin crawl. Words. Fragments of speech in a voice so soft it might have been imagination. James. No mistaking it. My name, spoken by a voice that was unmistakably female, carrying on the night air like a lover's sigh. I called out, my voice cracking with tension. Who's there? This is a restricted area. The forest swallowed my words and gave nothing back. Just silence so complete it felt oppressive, unnatural. But underneath that silence, I could swear I heard breathing. Not the wind. Not the settling of wood and metal. Breathing. Slow and steady, as if whatever was out there had all the time in the world. I stayed awake all night, clutching my flashlight like a talisman, jumping at every sound. The emergency phone remained stubbornly silent. The radio crackled with static, but no voices. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept over Demon's Crown Peak, I was exhausted, paranoid, and ready to call the whole thing off. But with sunrise came a return to normalcy. Birds began their morning chorus. A family of deer emerged from the forest to graze in a nearby meadow. Everything was peaceful, beautiful, ordinary. Maybe I'd imagined it all. Sleep deprivation could do strange things to the mind. But deep in my gut, in that primitive part of the brain that had kept our ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats stalked the darkness, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone on Vulture's Perch Ridge. Something else called this place home. And it had noticed me. The second night was worse. I barely slept during the day, catching only brief, fitful naps that left me feeling more exhausted than before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale light moving through the trees, heard that whispered voice calling my name on the wind. As darkness fell over the bleeding pine forest like a shroud, I found myself obsessively scanning the tree line every few minutes, the powerful binoculars never far from my hands. The forest below looked different at night, darker, more twisted, as if the very landscape was reshaping itself once the sun disappeared. The shadows between the trees seemed too deep, too black, like tears in the fabric of reality itself. At 2:23 a.m., I remember the exact time because I've been checking my watch compulsively. I saw him. A figure standing at the edge of Thornvale Meadow, where the forest thinned out into scattered pines and tall grass. A man, if you could call it that. But he was all wrong. Too tall for one thing. Even at this distance, I could tell he was at least 8 feet in height, maybe more. His limbs were elongated, stretched like taffy, arms hanging down past his knees. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if his neck had been broken and improperly healed. And he was staring directly at me. Even without the binoculars, I could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure against my chest. When I raised the lenses to get a better look, what I saw made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped them. Where his face should have been was a pale, smooth expanse of skin. No features except for 2 dark hollows where eyes might once have been. But despite the absence of eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that he was watching me with an intensity that was almost hungry. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, certain I was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress. When I looked again, he was gone. No movement. No sound of retreating footsteps through the undergrowth. No disturbance in the tall grass where he'd been standing. He had simply vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. But the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. Then the tapping returned, and this time it wasn't coming from beneath the floorboards. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the walls themselves, as if something with long skeletal fingers was walking around the outside of the observation cabin, testing the wooden panels for weaknesses. I swept the interior with my flashlight, the beam dancing wildly as my hands trembled. The cabin was empty, of course. Just me and the sparse furnishings and the growing certainty that I was trapped 70 feet above ground with something that defied explanation. I moved to the hatch and listened carefully before opening it. No sounds from the stairwell. I cracked it open and shone my light down the spiral of metal steps, half expecting to see that impossibly tall figure climbing toward me with inhuman grace. Nothing. But when I turned to close the hatch and return to the relative safety of the cabin's interior, the emergency phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence like a scream, nearly stopping my heart. The red phone that connected directly to the district office, the line that was only supposed to be used for true emergencies, rang with an insistence that seemed almost angry. I stumbled across the cabin and lifted the heavy handset with shaking fingers. "Hello? Sarah? What's wrong?" Static filled the line, not the clean white noise of a bad connection, but something organic and wet, like the sound of breathing underwater. Then faintly, almost lost in the electronic hiss, came a voice I didn't recognize. Male, deep, with an accent I couldn't place. "Don't look at it, boy. Whatever you do, don't look directly at it." The line went dead with a sharp click that seemed to echo in the small cabin. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind reeling. Who had that been? How had they gotten connected to an emergency line? And what were they warning me about? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, the tapping began again. But this time it was coming from above, from the roof of the observation cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if something was pacing back and forth directly over my head. The ceiling creaked with each step, dust drifting down like snow. Whatever was up, there was heavy, substantial real. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the door to the narrow walkway that circled the cabin. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp with the scent of pine and something else, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. The walkway was empty, but the footsteps continued above me, accompanied now by a sound that made my skin crawl, a wet, dragging noise, as if something was being pulled across the roof. I didn't sleep that night either. Couldn't even close my eyes without seeing that tall, faceless figure standing at the edge of the meadow, without hearing that mysterious voice on the phone, warning me not to look. But look at what? As dawn broke over the whispering Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I made a decision. I was getting out of here. Tower duty or no tower duty, assignment or no assignment, something was very wrong with Shadow Peak Watchtower and the surrounding bleeding pine forest. I'd pack up my gear, hike back down to my Jeep, and drive straight to the district office to report, what? That I'd seen a tall man who disappeared when I blinked. That I'd received a mysterious phone call warning me about something I couldn't identify. That I was hearing footsteps on the roof and voices in the wind. They'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But as I began stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The logbook. It was open to a fresh page, and there was a new entry written in handwriting I didn't recognize, spidery, old-fashioned script that looked like it belonged in a Victorian ledger. Day 2, the Watcher has been seen. The boundary grows thin. Soon, very soon, the old agreements will be honored. I hadn't written those words. I was the only person in the tower. Wasn't I? Despite every instinct screaming at me to stay barricaded in the observation cabin, I knew I had to investigate. The mysterious logbook entry had shaken me more than the sightings, more than the voices. Someone or something had been in the cabin while I was there. That realization was more terrifying than any ghostly apparition. I strapped on my pack and made my way down the tower's spiral staircase, each step ringing out like a bell in the morning stillness. The metal was slick with dew, and more than once I had to grab the railing to keep from slipping. Halfway down the trail that wound through Sorrow Creek Valley, I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Hiking boot. Not just any boot, my boot. The left Merrill that I'd lost 3 months ago while scrambling over loose rock near Devil's Falls, 40 miles south of here. I'd assumed it had tumbled into the creek and been washed downstream. But here it was, laced carefully around a low branch of a massive Douglas fir, as if someone had hung it there deliberately, like a trophy or a warning. The leather was weathered but intact, still bearing the distinctive scuff marks I remembered from when I'd slipped on wet granite. There was no doubt it was mine, but how had it gotten here? And who had hung it in this particular spot, along this particular trail? I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the forest around me for any sign of movement. The bleeding pine forest stretched in all directions, an impenetrable wall of green shadow and ancient secrets. Anything could be hiding among those massive trunks. That's when I heard the breathing. Not the steady rhythm of my own panic gasps, but something else entirely. Deep, ragged inhalations that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound echoed off the tree trunks, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. I spun around, flashlight raised like a weapon, even though it was broad daylight. Nothing, just trees and shadows and the distant sound of Sorrow Creek babbling over stones. But the breathing continued, growing louder, more labored, as if whatever was making the sound was struggling with some great effort. I ran. Not jogging, not hiking fast, full out running like my life depended on it. My pack bounced against my back, throwing off my balance, but I didn't dare slow down. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but I kept going, driven by a primal terror that overrode rational thought. Behind me, the breathing became a growl, then a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. I didn't stop running until I reached the base of Shadow Peak Watchtower, and even then I took the stairs 3 at a time, my legs burning with the effort. Only when I was back in the observation cabin with the hatch locked did I allow myself to collapse, gasping for air. As I struggled to catch my breath, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The logbook was open again. Another new entry, in the same spidery handwriting. Day 2 continued, he ran. They always run at first. But the forest remembers. The forest never forgets. And some things cannot be outrun. Below that, in fresher ink, were 3 words that made me whimper. You saw it. I slammed the logbook shut and shoved it into the desk drawer, but I could still feel the weight of those words pressing down on me like a physical force. Whatever was happening here, whatever cosmic joke was being played at my expense, it was escalating. The thing in the forest, the tall figure, the voice on the phone, the presence that left messages in the logbook while I slept, it was becoming bolder. And I was beginning to understand that I wasn't just an unwitting participant in this nightmare. I was the focal point. As afternoon faded into evening, I found myself pacing the small cabin like a caged animal, jumping at every sound, every shadow that moved outside the windows. The forest below looked different in the fading light, darker, more twisted, as if the very landscape was shifting when I wasn't looking directly at it. The tall pines seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching toward the tower like grasping fingers. The meadow where I'd seen the faceless figure now looked like a wound in the forest floor, a place where nothing would ever grow again. And everywhere, in every shadow, in every gap between the trees, I felt eyes watching me, waiting. The whispering began again as the sun disappeared behind Widow's Vale Mountain, but this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. A constant murmur of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, punctuated by my name repeated like a mantra, James, James, James. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from inside my skull, vibrating through my bones, until I couldn't tell where the voices ended and my own thoughts began. That's when I realized the truth that should have been obvious from the beginning. I wasn't going to leave Shadow Peak Watchtower. Whatever had claimed this place, whatever ancient thing made it home in the depths of the bleeding pine forest, it had marked me the moment I set foot on Vulture's Perch Ridge. The boot hanging from the tree hadn't been a trophy or a warning. It had been bait. Storm clouds rolled in with the darkness, but these weren't ordinary thunderheads. They hung low over the whispering ridge mountains like a funeral shroud, black as pitch and shot through with veins of sickly green lightning that made no sound when it struck. The air pressure dropped so suddenly that my ears popped, and I could taste copper on my tongue, the metallic flavor of fear and approaching doom. Through the observation cabin's windows, I watched the unnatural storm build over Demon's Crown Peak. The clouds moved wrong, swirling in patterns that hurt to look at directly, forming shapes that almost resembled faces, twisted, screaming faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. The wind picked up, howling through the tower's framework with a voice that sounded almost human, almost pleading. The entire structure swayed with each gust, metal groaning in protest. I tried the radio, desperate to contact someone, anyone in the outside world. But all I got was static punctuated by voices speaking in that same unknown language I've been hearing in my head. Sometimes I caught fragments that sounded like English, warnings, perhaps, or invitations, but they were too distorted to understand. That's when I noticed the rain beginning to fall. But this wasn't water cascading from the storm clouds above. It was black, thick as crude oil, viscous as blood. It struck the cabin's windows with wet, meaty sounds, not beating and running off like normal rain, but clinging to the glass, spreading like infection. As I watched in horrified fascination, the black substance began to move on its own, forming patterns and shapes across the windows. Symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. They pulsed with their own dim light, casting sickly shadows across the cabin's interior. Then I saw the faces. Within the flowing darkness, pale shapes pressed against the glass from the outside. Human faces, or things that had once been human, their features distorted by whatever unnatural force had claimed them. Their mouths moved silently, as if they were trying to tell me something important, something urgent. Their eyes, God, their eyes were black holes in their skulls, void dark and filled with an intelligence that was completely alien. I stumbled backward, knocking over my camp chair, and pressed myself against the far wall. But the faces followed me, sliding around the cabin's exterior, always watching, always pressing against the glass with increasing desperation. The storm intensified. Lightning, if it could still be called lightning, struck the tower directly, sending showers of green sparks cascading down the metal framework. The entire structure rang like a bell, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in my bones. And with each strike, the boundary between inside and outside grew thinner. The black rain began seeping through cracks in the window frames, pooling on the floor in patterns that definitely weren't random. It formed symbols, words, messages in that same alien script I'd seen on the glass. But somehow impossibly, I could read them now. The old covenant is broken. The Watcher has seen too much. The door must be opened. I screamed, raw animal sound that was lost in the howling wind. The emergency phone rang. I lunged for it, desperate for any connection to the world I'd known before this nightmare began. Help me, I shouted into the handset. Something's wrong at Shadow Peak. I need immediate evacuation. But the voice that answered wasn't Sarah Chin or any other ranger. It was my own voice, speaking with calm certainty. You can't leave, James. You're part of it now. You've always been part of it. I threw the phone across the cabin, where it shattered against the wall. That's when the tower began to groan and sway more violently. Not from the wind, but from something climbing up the outside. Heavy footsteps on the metal stairs, measured and deliberate. Each step sent vibrations through the entire structure, making the walls shake and dust rain down from the ceiling. Pling, pling, pling. Something was coming up from below, and I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't human. The hatch door at the center of the floor began to rattle against its locks, then to buckle outward, as if enormous pressure was being applied from underneath. The metal groaned. The hinges screamed. And then, boom, the hatch exploded upward, torn completely free of its moorings. A blast of fetid air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the stench of decay and something far worse, the smell of things that should never have drawn breath. I backed into the corner, flashlight shaking in my hands, as something began to emerge from the stairwell below. An arm appeared first, pale, impossibly long, with fingers that ended in black talons. Then a shoulder, hunched and misshapen. Finally, a head that was a mockery of human features. The thing that climbed into my sanctuary was the tall figure I'd seen at the tree line, but up close it was so much worse. Its skin was the color of old bone, stretched tight over a frame that was all wrong angles and impossible joints. Where its face should have been was a smooth expanse of flesh broken only by a vertical slit that opened and closed like a wound. When the slit parted, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth and something that might have been a tongue, black as the rain outside. It stood to its full height, easily 9 feet tall in the confined space of the cabin, and turned that terrible knot face toward me. "Now you belong here," it said, and its voice was the sound of winter wind through dead trees, of stones falling into bottomless wells, of all the world's loneliness given form. The words came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in my bones rather than my ears. "You've seen too much, Watcher. You've looked too deeply into the spaces between. And now you must stay." I tried to scream, try to run, try to do anything but stand there paralyzed by terror. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch as the thing reached out with one impossibly long arm, its clawed fingers stretching toward my face. When it touched me, the world exploded into darkness. Not the simple absence of light, but something far worse, a darkness that was alive, that crawled into my mouth and nose and eyes, that wrapped around my thoughts like chains. I felt myself falling, not through space but through time, through layers of reality I'd never imagined existed. I saw the history of Shadow Peak Watchtower, saw the rangers who had come before me, saw what had really happened to Thomas Blackwood in 1987. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't jumped. He had been chosen. Just like I was being chosen now. The last thing I remembered was the sound of my own laughter, high and mad and not entirely my own. I woke up what felt like hours later, though the pale light filtering through the cabin windows suggested it was well past sunrise. Weak sunlight streamed across a floor that was clean and dry, with no trace of the black rain or the symbols it had formed. The tower was quiet except for the normal sounds of wind and settling metal. Through the windows, the bleeding pine forest looked peaceful, almost inviting in the morning light. Birds were singing. A hawk circled lazily over Thornvale Meadow. Everything was normal, except for the logbook. It lay open on the desk, and the page was covered with my handwriting, neat, careful script that recorded a routine weekend at a fire lookout tower. Weather observations, wind speeds, a brief note about a family of deer spotted near Sorrow Creek. No mention of strange lights or tall figures. No record of mysterious phone calls or black rain. Just the mundane details of a ranger doing his job. But at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was definitely mine but somehow different, older, more confident, was a final entry. "The new watcher has been inducted. The vigil continues. Some boundaries must be maintained. Some doors must remain guarded. The things that dwell in the spaces between worlds must not be allowed to cross over." I understand now. I have always understood. Shadow Peak Watchtower is not just a fire lookout. It is a watchtower in the truest sense, a guard post at the edge of reality, where someone must always stand watch against the things that hunger for our world. I am that someone now. I have joined the ranks of the Watchers, the guardians of the threshold. Thomas Blackwood before me, and others before him, stretching back to when this tower was built on ground that was already sacred, already claimed. My replacement will come eventually when I have served my time. And when they do, I will pass on the vigil as it was passed to me. This is the way it has always been. This is the way it must be. I stared at the words I had apparently written, though I had no memory of doing so. They felt true in a way that bypassed rational thought, resonating in the deepest part of my mind like an echo of something I'd always known. I was airlifted out that afternoon after missing 2 scheduled check-ins. The helicopter crew found me sitting calmly at the observation desk, making notes about wind patterns and cloud formations. I told them I'd been sick food poisoning from bad MREs, and they accepted the explanation without question. The medical team at the base hospital found nothing wrong with me except mild dehydration and exhaustion. I was cleared for duty within 48 hours and reassigned to a tower in the Southern District, far from the Whispering Ridge Mountains. I didn't protest. I didn't ask to go back to Shadow Peak. But I think about it every day. I think about the bleeding pine forest and the things that move through its shadows. I think about the tall figure with a knot face, and I wonder if it's still standing at the edge of Thornvale Meadow, waiting for the next watcher to arrive. Because here's what I know now, what I learned during those 3 days on Vulture's Perch Ridge. Shadow Peak Watchtower should have stayed closed, should have been torn down and the ground salted, the way they do with places that have been touched by things beyond human understanding. Some places weren't built for us. They're watchtowers, yes, but not for fires. They're sentinel posts at the boundaries between worlds, where ancient agreements are honored and terrible bargains are kept, where someone must always stand guard against the things that press against the walls of reality, hungry for a way through. The rangers who serve there aren't just employees of the Forest Service. They're guardians, whether they know it or not, chosen by forces that predate human civilization, inducted into a brotherhood of watchers that stretches back to the dawn of time. And once you've been chosen, once you've looked directly into the spaces between worlds and seen what dwells there, you're marked. Chain, part of something larger and darker than you can imagine. I still get the dreams. Visions of Shadow Peak Watchtower standing alone on its ridge, windows glowing with that pale, sickly light. I see the bleeding pine forest spreading like a cancer across the mountainside, and I know that somewhere in its depths, the tall figure waits patiently for the next watcher to arrive. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth and the smell of pine sap on my clothes, even though I'm hundreds of miles away. Sometimes I find myself writing in that same careful script, recording observations I shouldn't know, describing places I've never been. The other rangers think I'm different now, quieter, more watchful. They're not wrong. Sarah Chen retired early, just 3 months after my assignment to Shadow Peak. Said she needed to spend more time with her family, but I saw the fear in her eyes when she looked at me. She knew something had happened up there, even if she couldn't name it. The tower has been officially decommissioned again. The access trail is blocked with concrete barriers and warning signs. But I know that's just for show, just to keep the curious away until the next watcher is chosen. Because there will always be a next watcher. There has to be. The things in the forest, the entities that slip between dimensions like smoke through cracks, they never stop trying to break through. They never stop testing the boundaries, looking for weak spots in the fabric of reality. And someone has to watch. Someone has to stand guard. If you ever find yourself driving through the Whispering Ridge Mountains, if you ever catch a glimpse of Shadow Peak Watchtower silhouetted against the sky like a dark finger pointing toward heaven, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look too long. Don't let curiosity overcome common sense. Because if you stare too long into the bleeding pine forest, if you feel the weight of unseen eyes watching you from the shadows between the trees, you might find yourself receiving an email one day. A reassignment. A routine rotation. Just for the weekend. And if that happens, if you ever climb those spiral stairs and settle into that cramped observation cabin with its blood-stained history and its terrible purpose, remember what I've told you. Remember that some things should never be seen directly. Remember that once you've been chosen as a watcher, you can never truly leave. And remember that in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the black rain falls and the voices whisper your name on the wind, the most important thing is not to look away. Because the moment you stop watching, the moment you abandon your post, the things that hunger for our world will finally find their way through. And then God help us all. Final note, found written in the margin of the original report in handwriting that matches no known Forest Service employee. The new watcher serves well. The vigil continues. The boundaries hold. For now. There's a trail in the Whispering Hollows that doesn't show up on any map. No GPS pin, no signposts, no markers carved into weathered oak. Just a narrow split in the ancient trees, like the primeval forest trying to whisper a secret that should never be spoken aloud. I'm a trail steward with the U.S. Forest Service. 23 years I've spent clearing paths across Kentucky's most treacherous terrain, from the manicured hiking loops that comfort weekend warriors to the forgotten backcountry cut-throughs that only the deer and the desperate remember. I know these woods like the rhythm of my own heartbeat, like the texture of my own skin worn raw by thorns and weather. Every ridge, every hollow, every creek that runs cold with mountain runoff. So when I tell you I found a trail that isn't supposed to exist, a path that breathes and shifts and calls your name in voices you've never heard, and that I walked it willingly into the belly of something ancient and hungry, and that something followed me back through dimensions that fold like origami in a madman's hands, I need you to believe me. Because this isn't a ghost story spun around a campfire to make children shiver. It's a warning carved in bone and terror. There are places out here where the earth folds wrong, where time pools like stagnant water, where the air hums with frequencies that make your teeth ache and your vision blur. Places where the boundary between what is and what shouldn't be grows thin as tissue paper. And if you stray too far from what's been charted by human hands, the woods notice. They take inventory. They remember your scent, your footprint, the particular way your heart hammers against your ribs when fear takes hold. And sometimes, God help us, they don't let you come back the same. Or at all. I was just trying to clear a rock fall that morning in the Bone Valley Passage. Standard maintenance after the storms. It was supposed to be routine, mundane, forgettable. But that trail, that impossible breathing pathway, it didn't just appear. It chose me. And what I saw in that place where geography becomes suggestion, what I heard echoing through caverns that exist in no surveyor's chart, it still claws at the inside of my skull every night, leaving scratches on my sanity that refuse to heal. Somewhere out there, beyond the mapped world, beyond the reach of satellite and compass, is a path that only reveals itself when it hungers. And it doesn't want you to leave, ever. This is the story of the trail that doesn't exist. And the thing that waits at the end, patient as stone, hungry as winter. The report came in at dawn, landslide near Devil's Throat Ridge. Minor collapse, they said, probably loosened by the biblical rains we've been having. Nothing unusual for October in these mountains where water carves new scars every season. I grabbed my gear from the equipment shed, chainsaw, pry bar, emergency radio, the usual arsenal for battling gravity's handiwork. The morning mist clung to the valleys like the breath of sleeping giants, and the air held that particular bite that promised an early winter. I took the service road to Shadowmere Creek, then switched to the maintenance trail that snakes past the old mining cuts. Every step was familiar territory. I'd walked this route so many times I could navigate it blind, counting the gnarled roots that caught unwary boots, anticipating the loose shale that shifted like broken promises underfoot. The morning was pristine. Cardinals flashed red among the yellowing maples. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that lifted from the warming earth. Normal. Peaceful. The kind of day that makes you forget there are dark corners in the world where reason goes to die. Until I passed the lightning oak. That's what we call the massive white oak struck by lightning 3 summers back, split clean down the middle, but still living, its two halves reaching toward heaven like supplicating arms. I'd used it as a landmark for years. But this morning, something was different. Carved into the earth beside it was a path I'd never seen before. Not just overgrown or forgotten, never seen. And I would have remembered. The opening was too perfect, too deliberate. The trees bent inward at unnatural angles, creating a tunnel of living that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Moss hung like curtains, parting gently in a breeze I couldn't feel on my skin. And beneath the normal forest sounds, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, I heard something else. A vibration. Deep and primal, like the earth's own pulse. It traveled through the soles of my boots, up through my bones, settling in my chest cavity where it hummed in harmony with my heartbeat. I pulled out my radio, finger hovering over the transmit button. "Base, this is Ranger Mitchell. I'm at the Lightning Oak site, about 50 yards northeast of Devil's Throat Ridge. Found an unmarked trail. Looks fresh, might be erosion damage from the storms. Investigating." The radio crackled with static before Sarah's voice came through. "Copy that, Mitchell. Be careful out there. Weather's turning again." I clipped the radio back to my belt and approached the opening. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, but it was perfect. Too perfect. No fallen branches cluttered the way. No roots buckled the earth. The ground was smooth as if worn by countless footsteps, yet the moss on either side showed no signs of disturbance. I should have turned back. Should have marked it for the survey team and returned with backup. Should have listened to the ice-cold finger that traced my spine as I stepped into that tunnel of whispering trees. Instead, I crossed the threshold. And everything changed. The silence hit me like a physical blow. Not the absence of sound, something deeper. A consumption of sound, as if the very air had developed an appetite for noise and swallowed every natural harmony of the forest. No birds called warnings to their mates. No insects buzzed their ancient songs. The wind that had been stirring the canopy above simply stopped. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as though I were walking through deep snow instead of firm earth. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen showed only static, dancing pixels that formed no coherent image. My watch had stopped at 8:47, though I was certain I'd been walking for at least 20 minutes. The path continued straight ahead, cutting through the forest with surgical precision. Ancient oaks and maples towered on either side, their trunks massive beyond anything I'd seen in the documented sections of the Whispering Hollows. Some were so large that 10 men holding hands couldn't encircle them. And they were old. Not just decades old, centuries old. Their bark carried scars from fires that had burned before European settlers first glimpsed these mountains. Yet the growth patterns were wrong, twisted, as if they'd grown under an alien sun. My compass needle began to drift. At first, just a minor deviation, a few degrees east of where it should have pointed. But as I walked deeper into that impossible tunnel of living wood, the needle spun lazily, then faster, until it whirled like a broken toy before jamming hard to the southwest. I was walking northeast. I was certain of that. The morning sun had been on my right when I entered the path, and it remained there, though the light seemed strange now, filtered through leaves that shifted colors like oil on water. I tried the radio again. Dead silence. Not even static. The display showed full signal strength, but when I keyed the microphone, nothing happened. The LED that should have flashed red remained dark, as if the device had forgotten its purpose. That's when I noticed the trees were getting closer. Not obviously, just a subtle narrowing of the space between the massive trunks. The canopy above seemed to press downward, and shadows that had been distinct and crisp began to blur at the edges, flowing together like spilled ink. I walked for what felt like an hour, but my stopped watch insisted only minutes had passed. Distance became meaningless. Direction became a suggestion rather than a certainty. The path curved gently left, then right, following contours that didn't match the topography I knew existed here. And then I saw the split. The trail divided into 3 identical paths. Not a natural branching where water had carved separate channels or deer had worn different routes to the same destination. These were perfect divisions, geometric precision that nature never achieves without help. Each path was identical in width, in the texture of the earth, in the way the trees formed perfect archways overhead. The moss patterns matched exactly. Even the quality of light filtering through the canopy was the same. I pulled orange surveyor's tape from my pack and tied it around the oak where the paths met, marking my entry point. The tree's bark felt strange under my fingers, not rough like living wood, but smooth and warm, almost like skin. I chose the middle path, reasoning that it would be easiest to find again. 3 steps in, I heard footsteps behind me. Deliberate, measured, matching my own pace exactly. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. The path stretched empty behind me, disappearing into the shadows between the ancient trees. But the footsteps continued, not behind me now, but beside me. Invisible boots striking invisible ground with the exact rhythm of my own gait. I broke into a run. The footsteps matched my pace perfectly. When I stopped, gasping, bent over with my hands on my knees, the forest fell silent again. But in that silence, I heard something that turned my blood to Arctic water. My own voice calling from somewhere ahead. Hey, over here. I found something. It wasn't an echo. Echoes distort, fade, lose their clarity as they bounce off rock and tree. This was perfect reproduction. My voice, my inflection, my words. But I hadn't spoken. I looked back toward the split in the trail, seeking the comfort of my orange marker. The path behind me was gone. Where it should have been, ancient trees grew in unbroken ranks, their trunks so close together that a rabbit would have struggled to pass between them. No gap, no opening, no sign that a path had ever existed. My orange tape had vanished as if it had never been tied. The voice called again, closer now. Come on, you have to see this. And despite every instinct screaming at me to lie down, to close my eyes, to wake up from this impossible nightmare, I followed the sound of my own voice deeper into the breathing dark. It stepped out from behind a massive hemlock like it had been waiting there for hours. Same boots, Merrill hiking boots with a distinctive scuff mark on the left toe where I'd kicked a stubborn rock 3 months ago. Same khaki pants with the small tear above the right knee. Same Forest Service jacket with the patches in exactly the right places. Same weathered hands, same wedding ring catching what little light filtered through the canopy. Same face. My face. But the eyes, Jesus Christ, the eyes were all wrong. Too wide, like someone had stretched the lids beyond human limits. Too still, without the constant micro-movements that make living eyes alive. And behind the familiar blue irises lurked something ancient and patient and absolutely, fundamentally other. It smiled at me with my own lips, but the expression was a mockery of human warmth. The corners turned up at precisely the wrong angle. The teeth, my teeth, seemed too sharp, too many, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I stepped backward, my hand moving instinctively to the multi-tool on my belt. It stepped forward with perfect precision, maintaining the exact distance between us. Who are you? I whispered, though I already knew the answer would be worse than the question. Its head tilted at an angle no human neck should achieve, 30 degrees past the breaking point. And when it spoke, it used my voice with my exact cadence, down to the slight rasp I developed from years of calling across mountain valleys. Who are you? But underneath my familiar voice, I heard something else. A harmonic. A resonance that spoke in frequencies only terror understands. It was the sound of wind through empty sockets, of roots growing through abandoned coffins, of time itself wearing thin in places where it was never meant to bend. The thing wearing my face straightened its impossible neck with a sound like breaking branches. Then it lunged. Not like a human being driven by desperation or rage, like a spider dropping from its web, all angles and joints and predatory precision. Its limbs moved in ways that defied anatomy, bending at points where no joints existed, extending to lengths that should have snapped bone and torn muscle. I ran, harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through undergrowth that parted like water before snapping back with whip-crack violence. Branches tore at my clothes, my skin, my sanity. The forest seemed to fold around me, creating new obstacles where none had existed seconds before. Trees bent like rubber, their trunks twisting into impossible spirals. Roots erupted from the earth to snare my ankles. The ground itself rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond, throwing off my balance, making each step a gamble with gravity. Behind me, that thing that wore my skin gave chase. But it didn't run like a human. It moved like water flowing uphill, like smoke given weight and malice. Sometimes it was behind me, sometimes beside me, just visible in my peripheral vision. Once, impossibly, I glimpsed it ahead, waiting with that patient, terrible smile before dissolving back into the shadows between the trees. The path, if it could still be called a path, twisted through landscape that belonged in no earthly geography. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks scarred with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The sky above, what little I could see through the increasingly dense canopy, had taken on a sickly green tinge, like the light that precedes the worst storms. I stumbled into a clearing and stopped so suddenly I nearly fell forward. The space was perfectly circular, as if someone had used a massive compass to carve it from the living forest. But this wasn't natural clearance. Every tree around the perimeter had been bent away from the center, their trunks twisted into impossible arcs, their branches reaching desperately toward the diseased sky like the arms of drowning men. The ground was scorched black, not with the scattered patterns of wildfire, but with geometric precision. Concentric circles of ash and char spread outward from the center like ripples in a dark pond. The air above shimmered with heat that had no source, and when I breathed, I tasted copper and ozone and something else, something organic and rotten and wrong. In the center of the clearing stood a stone arch. It was ancient beyond measure, carved from black granite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The stone was covered in moss and lichen, but not randomly. The growth formed patterns, sigils, hieroglyphs that shifted and changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. The arch stood alone, supporting nothing but air. Yet through its opening, I could see not the trees that should have been visible on the other side, but something else entirely. A tunnel that stretched beyond sight, lined with walls that pulsed like the interior of a massive heart. The impossible trail I've been following led directly into it. And that thing that wore my face, it stopped at the edge of the scorched earth. Didn't cross. Couldn't cross. Some invisible barrier held it at bay, and for the first time, its perfect smile faltered. The two wide eyes narrowed, and when it spoke, my voice carried harmonics of pure hatred. You're not supposed to be here. Its form began to waver, like heat mirages rising from summer asphalt. The familiar features, my features, started to melt and run together, revealing glimpses of something underneath that my mind refused to process. You're not supposed to see. Then it melted backward into the nearest tree, not like smoke dissipating, but like liquid being absorbed. The bark rippled and settled, and for a moment, just a moment, I could see my face pressed against the inner surface of the wood, mouth open in a silent scream. Then nothing. Just the ancient arch and the tunnel beyond, waiting with the patience of geological time. I don't know why I stepped through that threshold of black stone. Maybe it was curiosity, the same fatal fascination that leads people to lean over cliffs or touch live wires. Maybe it was panic, the desperate need to escape something worse than the unknown. Maybe it was simply madness, the final snapping of a mind that had seen too much impossibility in too short a time. Or maybe the arch wanted me to step through, and I was never really making a choice at all. The moment my boot crossed the threshold, reality folded. My ears popped like I was descending rapidly in an airplane. My skin went cold, then hot, then cold again. Every nerve ending fired at once, sending cascades of phantom sensation racing through my body. Then the sky. The sky was wrong. Instead of the familiar blue of Kentucky autumn, a blood-orange haze stretched overhead, thick as syrup, pulsing with its own sickly light. It filtered down through trees that shouldn't exist, massive specimens with bark that moved like muscle and leaves that whispered secrets in languages that predated human speech. The forest breathed around me. I could feel it, the slow inhalation that drew moisture from the air, the longer exhalation that released spores and pollen and things that made my sinuses burn. The trees swayed without wind, their roots shifting beneath the loamy soil like the coils of sleeping serpents. This wasn't Kentucky anymore. This wasn't anywhere that belonged on maps drawn by human hands. Every shadow flickered with half-seen movement. Every shape twitched and reformed when I wasn't looking directly at it. The normal rules, perspective, proportion, the reliable behavior of light and space had been suspended here, replaced by geometries that made my eyes water and my brain stutter. From somewhere deeper in this alien forest, I heard chanting. Not human voices, not any language ever spoken by tongues of flesh and blood. These were sounds that bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating through bone and marrow, settling in the deepest parts of the brain where fear lives alongside the memories we're born with. Rhythmic, endless, patient as the turning of seasons. I stumbled forward through undergrowth that parted before me and closed behind, following game trails that led in directions that had no names. The chanting grew louder, not closer, but more, as if additional voices were joining the chorus with each step I took. Then I saw them. They stood in a perfect circle in a grove where the blood-orange light gathered like honey. Tall figures, 8 feet, maybe more, wrapped in bark that grew directly from their skin. Not clothing, but integration. Wood and flesh merged in patterns that hurt to comprehend. No faces, just holes where eyes should be, dark hollows that seemed to extend infinitely inward. Their mouths, if they could be called mouths, were vertical slits in the bark, opening and closing in rhythm with the chanting that came from everywhere and nowhere. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, just stood there like ancient trees that had learned to dream, their root feet buried deep in earth that pulsed with veins of phosphorescent light. In the center of their circle lay a pile of Forest Service gear, khaki uniforms, hiking boots, radio equipment, name tags and patches, and the small personal items that rangers carry, everything laid out with ritual precision on an altar of white stone. I recognized my own patch among the others, my nameplate, my jacket, but they were old, ancient, covered in moss and lichens that had taken decades to establish themselves. The fabric was rotted, the leather cracked and brittle, the metal corroded beyond recognition. I looked down at myself. I was still wearing my uniform, still had my nameplate clipped to my chest, my patches sewn to my sleeves. So whose gear was that? And how long had it been waiting for me? The chanting stopped. As one, the bark-wrapped figures turned their eyeless faces toward me. Those vertical mouth slits opened wider, revealing depths that held no tongue, no throat, just more darkness stretching down into the roots of the world. They spoke in unison, their voices the sound of wind through autumn leaves, of ice cracking on mountain lakes, of earth settling over buried things. Welcome home. I turned and ran through a forest that rearranged itself with every desperate step. Trees sprang up where none had been seconds before. The ground buckled and flowed like water, creating hills where valleys should be, opening chasms that hadn't existed in the moment before my foot would have found solid earth. The chanting followed me, not pursuing, but everywhere. It rose from the soil beneath my feet, descended from the bleeding sky above, emanated from the pores of the living trees. It was the forest's heartbeat, the rhythm by which this impossible place measured time. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs shook with exhaustion, until a taste of copper filled my mouth and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. When I finally collapsed beside the massive root system of something that might once have been an oak, the alien forest fell silent around me. I must have passed out. When I woke, I was back on a trail. But not the same trail. Not the impossible path that had led me through the stone arch into that realm where bark and flesh merge in patterns that violated every natural law. This was different. Familiar, yet wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The trees were thinner here, younger. The undergrowth had the scraggly, opportunistic look of forest recovering from some ancient disturbance. And the air smelled of rust and abandonment, and the particular mustiness that clings to places where humans once lived but live no longer. Then I saw the sign. Weathered wood, the paint faded and peeling, but still legible. Welcome to Dead Man's Hollow Trail, EST 1952. My blood turned to ice water. Deadman's Hollow had been closed for 43 years. Shut down after a series of accidents, hikers who went missing, search parties that came back with fewer members than they'd started with, rangers who reported things that couldn't be included in official reports without raising questions about their fitness for duty. The trail had been officially erased from all maps in 1981. The access roads gated. The trailheads removed. Even the old-timers had stopped talking about it, as if the place had been surgically excised from collective memory. Yet here I was, walking on maintained trail through what should have been impenetrable wilderness. My watch was still stopped at 8:47, but the quality of light filtering through the canopy suggested late afternoon. I'd lost hours, maybe more, and that place beyond the arch time moved differently there, or perhaps it didn't move at all. I hiked for what felt like an eternity through landscape that grew increasingly familiar and increasingly wrong with each step. The trail markers I passed bore numbers from a defunct system. The bridges I crossed had been condemned and removed decades ago, yet here they stood, solid and functional, spanning gorges that didn't appear on any current survey. As dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, normal colors, blessed and familiar after that blood-orange haze, I finally reached a Forest Service road. A pickup truck was parked at the trailhead, its engine running. Behind the wheel sat a man in a logging company vest, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't seem surprised to see me emerge from a trail that shouldn't exist. I waved him down, my legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. "Where'd you come from?" he asked as I approached the passenger window. His voice carried the flat accent of Eastern Kentucky, but underneath it lurked something else, an inflection I couldn't place, as if he'd learned English as a second language but had forgotten what his first had been. "I'm a park ranger," I said, showing him my badge. "Got lost on a trail that..." I stopped. How do you explain the unexplainable to a stranger? Trail that doesn't exist. He nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Happens more than you'd think," he said. "Hop in. I'll get you back to civilization." He didn't ask questions during the drive. Didn't comment on my torn clothes or the scratches covering my hands and face. Just drove through mountain roads that seemed right but felt wrong, past landmarks that belonged to my memory but not to current geography. When he dropped me off at the Forest Service station, I thanked him and asked his name. He smiled, the first genuine human expression I'd seen in hours. "Name's not important," he said, "but you might want to check your phone." I pulled out my cell phone as his truck disappeared around a bend in the road. The screen showed 3 missed calls, all from my own number. The timestamps showed they'd been placed while I was walking through that impossible forest, in that place where my reflection had worn the wrong expression and ancient things chanted in languages that scraped against sanity. I listened to the first voicemail with trembling fingers. My own voice spoke from the tiny speaker. "Don't come looking for me. I'm where I'm supposed to be now. Where I've always been." The second message was shorter. "The trail remembers everyone who walks it, even the ones who think they got away." The third was just breathing. Slow, measured inhalations and exhalations that matched the rhythm of that alien forest heartbeat. I deleted all 3 messages and threw the phone in the nearest trash can. Back at headquarters, I sat across from my supervisor's desk like a defendant awaiting judgment. Sarah Martinez had been running forest operations in this district for 15 years. She'd seen rangers come back from the deep woods with stories that didn't fit in official reports, tales of sounds that had no source, shadows that fell upward, clearings where compasses spun like prayer wheels. She listened to my account without interruption, her weathered hands folded on the desk between us. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if looking for signs of heat stroke or mental breakdown. Finally, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder marked with a single character, 0. "You're not the first," she said, opening the folder to reveal a stack of photographs, incident reports, and handwritten accounts dating back decades. The photos made my vision swim. There was my uniform among the others in that ritual circle. My nameplate. My jacket. But also dozens of other pieces of Forest Service gear, arranged with the same ceremonial precision on that altar of white stone. We don't chart it, Sarah said, closing the folder. Because it charts us. I asked what that meant, but she just shook her head. Some trails aren't meant for maps, she said. They exist in the spaces between what we know and what we can't afford to admit. They've been here longer than our service, longer than our maps, longer than the people who first walked these mountains. She handed me a new radio, a replacement for the one that had died in that place where sound went to surrender. The old-timers had a name for it, she continued. They called it the Hungry Path. Said it only appeared to people who belonged to it, people who'd wandered too far from what's safe and known. I started to ask how many rangers had disappeared on the Hungry Path, but she anticipated the question. None, she said. They all come back, but they're never quite the same. She was right. I burned my uniform that night, the one I'd been wearing when I stepped through that arch of black stone. Burned it in my backyard fire pit and scattered the ashes in running water, following half-remembered folk wisdom about breaking connections to places that shouldn't be connected to. But it didn't matter, because I can still feel it out there, that impossible trail threading through the whispering hollows, patient as stone, hungry as winter. It's waiting for me to forget, to let my guard down, to take a familiar path just a few steps too far from the mapped world. I don't hike alone anymore. Don't stray from marked trails. Don't investigate reports of new paths carved by recent storms. And I never, ever follow game trails that lead in directions my compass can't explain. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when sleep refuses to come, I hear chanting carried on the wind, rhythmic and endless, calling me back to that place where bark and flesh merge, where time pools like stagnant water, where ancient things tend altars built from the belongings of those who thought they could walk between worlds and return unchanged. The Hungry Path is still out there, still waiting, still adding to its collection. If you're ever in the woods, anywhere, and you see a trail you don't recognize, a path that seems too perfect, too inviting, too eager to swallow your footsteps, don't be curious. Don't be brave. Don't trust the voice that whispers just a little farther. Walk away. Run if you have to. Because some hungers are older than human civilization, and some paths only lead one way. The forest remembers everyone who feeds it. And it's always, always hungry. You ever stare into a forest so long that it feels like it's staring back? I'm not talking about a peaceful, on a nice hike kind of forest. I mean that thick, choking tree line where everything seems too still. No wind, no birdsong, not even the scurry of a squirrel. Just trees and silence and that feeling like something's watching you, just out of sight. That's the kind of forest I worked in. Name's Cole. I've been a park ranger in the Shadowmere Cascade Range for over 12 years. The locals used to call these mountains the Bone Ridges before the Park Service sanitized the name. You'd think that would have been a warning. Seen everything from drunken hikers to bear maulings in my time. Hell, I've pulled 3 bodies out of Widow's Gorge and found enough lost souls in Devil's Throat Canyon to fill a small cemetery. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepare me for the thing I saw out at the Mornwood sector, grid reference 39G. The old-timers in nearby Greyfall Township whispered about that place long before it became part of our patrol route. They called it the Hungering Wood, said it ate people whole, left no trace. Of course, we laughed that off as backwoods superstition. Mountain folk love their ghost stories. There's a reason we don't let campers out that far anymore. The forest there is wrong in ways that make your skin crawl and your gut twist. The air's heavier, thick as molasses in your lungs, like breathing through wet wool. Your compass spins a little too easily, sometimes pointing to directions that don't exist on any map. Radios crackle with static, even when they're fully charged, picking up voices that speak in languages that sound almost familiar but hurt to listen to. And then there's that smell, like wet iron and rotting pine, underscored by something sickeningly sweet, like flowers left too long on a grave. We used to laugh it off, blame it on sulfur deposits from the old deadfall mine or some massive animal den hidden in the root systems. The geologists said the iron content in the soil was unusually high. The wildlife biologists noted the curious absence of normal forest fauna. Everyone had neat scientific explanations. We don't laugh anymore. The trees themselves seemed diseased out there, not with any fungus or blight you could name, but with something that makes them grow in twisted spirals, their bark scarred with patterns that look almost like writing. If you stare too long at those marks, they start to shift, rearrange themselves into shapes that your mind tries desperately not to recognize. I know what I saw, and I'm going to tell you. Not because I want to, but because someone needs to know. Because someone needs to understand that there are places in this world where the rules we live by simply don't apply. Places where the very earth remembers things it shouldn't. So if you're watching this alone, late at night, I'd suggest turning on a light. Maybe two. And if you've got windows facing any stretch of dark forest, you might want to close those blinds. Because it starts the same way it always does with a missing hiker. They said her name was Laura Mendes, 29 years old, solo backpacker from Portland. Experienced outdoors woman, the kind who could navigate by stars and start a fire in a downpour. She'd left a note in her car at the Thornwick Ranger Station, hiking the Serpent Spine Trail loop back by Sunday. The note was written in careful block letters, like she was making sure someone could read it clearly, like she knew it might be important. She never came back. Dispatch sent me and my partner Jamie to check it out. Standard missing person protocol. We figured she got lost, maybe took a wrong turn at one of the unmarked deer paths, or rolled an ankle and was waiting for help. Happens more often than you'd think, especially in the maze-like ravines around Sorrow Creek. We had no idea what we were walking into, and we should have turned back the moment we saw the birds. Did. Dozens of them. Ravens, mostly, but some hawks and owls, too. All clustered near the base of the great pines that marked the entrance to the deep woods. No signs of trauma, no blood, no broken wings. They looked almost peaceful if you ignore their eyes. Wide open, reflecting the pale morning light like black mirrors. Eyes that seemed to track our movement even in death. I remember Jamie whispering, "What the hell does that?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I didn't have an answer. Still don't. But something had been there. Something had watched them die, watched them fall from the sky in perfect silence. And now it was watching us. We radioed it in to the Thornwick station. Told dispatch about the birds, about the unnatural silence that seemed to press against our eardrums like a physical weight. They told us to keep going, to locate the hiker if we could. Standard protocol, they said. Log everything for the incident report. But this wasn't standard. Nothing about the Mornwood sector ever was. Jamie kept glancing over his shoulder as we moved deeper into the forest, and I noticed he'd unbuckled the strap on his sidearm. His fingers drummed nervously against his radio, a habit he developed during his first year on the job. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both felt it, that tension in the air, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The normal sounds of woodland life were completely absent. No rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, no woodpecker tapping, no distant howl of coyotes. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees were absorbing sound itself. Our boots on the trail sounded unnaturally loud, each step echoing slightly in ways that didn't make sense. We pushed deeper into the northern quadrant, following the Serpent Spine Trail that Laura had marked on her planned route. The path narrowed as we went, ancient root systems creating natural barriers that forced us to climb over and duck under. Moss covered everything like a thick green carpet, swallowing our steps and making the world feel muffled, dreamlike. The trees pressed in close on either side, their canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sky, turning midday into a perpetual twilight. About 3 miles in, just past the old wooden marker that read Whisperfall Grove, elevation 4,200 feet, we found her camp. Or what was left of it. Her tent had been shredded, not torn or ripped, but shredded, like something with massive claws had systematically destroyed every inch of fabric. The pieces hung from nearby branches like prayer flags, fluttering in a breeze we couldn't feel. Her sleeping bag was soaked in something brown and sticky that had attracted swarms of flies. The smell was overwhelming, metallic and rotten, with that same sickly sweet undertone we'd noticed at the sector boundary. Her backpack had been tossed into a tree, jammed high into the branches of a massive pine, at least 20 feet off the ground. The pack hung there like some kind of offering, slowly rotating in the still air. No blood. No obvious tracks leading away from the site. Just ruin. Deliberate, methodical destruction that spoke of intelligence behind it. Jamie looked at me, his face pale in the filtered light. "You thinking, Bear?" I shook my head slowly, studying the scene. Bears don't throw 40-pound packs 20 feet in the air, and they don't shred tents into perfect ribbons. We circled the campsite carefully, looking for anything that might give us a clue about what happened to Lara. That's when I noticed them, the footprints pressed into the soft earth near what had been her fire pit. But they weren't hers. These were larger, much deeper, as if made by something incredibly heavy. And they were barefoot, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced. They looked almost human at first glance, but the proportions were all off, like someone had tried to recreate human feet from a vague description. More disturbing was the pattern they made. There were only 2 sets of tracks. Lara's hiking boots going into the campsite, setting up, moving around the area as she'd gone about her evening routine. And then these other prints, moving in a perfect circle around where her tent had been pitched. Around and around, like something had been watching her sleep, studying her. Then both sets of tracks led away from the campsite together, hers stumbling and erratic, the others maintaining that same steady, measured pace. Whatever it was, it had walked away calmly. Not a struggle, not a chase. Just a steady stride, like it wasn't in a hurry. Like it knew exactly where it was going. Like it knew we'd follow. I didn't want to. Every instinct I developed in 12 years of wilderness work was screaming at me to call for backup, to retreat to the ranger station, to let someone else handle this. But Jamie had already drawn his flashlight and started following the trail. I couldn't let him go alone. We moved in silence for maybe 20 minutes, following the tracks as they led us through increasingly dense forest. The trail took us through a thick patch of ancient cedar trees, their trunks so massive it would take 4 people holding hands to encircle them. The bark was scarred with those same strange markings we'd seen elsewhere in the sector, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when you weren't looking directly at them. That's when we heard it for the first time. Not a growl, not a howl, not any sound an animal should make. It was laughter. A low, raspy chuckle echoing through the trees from somewhere ahead of us. Male-sounding, but wrong in every possible way. Distorted, like someone imitating a laugh without understanding what laughter actually meant. It had a wet quality to it, as if the throat producing it was damaged or different. Jamie froze mid-step, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, unable to speak. My mouth had gone completely dry. Then it came again, closer this time and longer. The sound seemed to bounce off the trees in impossible ways, coming from all directions at once. It was followed by something that sounded almost like whispered words, but in no language I'd ever heard. I raised the radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Cole in Mornwood Sector 39G. We're investigating the Mendez disappearance. Possible hostile presence in the area. Requesting immediate backup and air support." Static filled the channel for several long seconds. Then, cutting through the white noise, came a voice I didn't recognize, thin, crackling, barely human. "Dee Dee, don't let it see your FF face." The transmission cut out abruptly. Jamie stared at me, his face white as paper. That was the same voice I heard on the radio 2 nights ago during my shift at Raven's Hollow Lookout. I nodded grimly. Same one I heard last week at the Thornwick station. Always at night. Always when I was alone. He didn't argue, didn't ask questions. Just clicked the safety off his pistol with a soft metallic snap that seemed to echo in the unnatural silence. The footprints we'd been following veered sharply downhill, leading toward the tree line where the ancient forest grew thicker and the light thinned into permanent darkness. I hiked through most of the Shadowmere Cascade Range, but I'd never seen trees like these. They were old, older than old, their trunks twisted into spirals that hurt to look at, their branches interweaving overhead like the fingers of clasped hands. They stood too tall, too still, like living monuments to something that shouldn't exist. That's when the smell hit us full force. The rot. It rolled out of the deep woods in a wave that made our eyes water and our stomachs clench. Thick and metallic, like old blood mixed with decay, but underneath it was something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of funeral flowers left too long in a closed room. Jamie gagged, pressing his sleeve against his nose and mouth. Jesus Christ, that's... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because that's when we saw it. A clearing opened up ahead of us, maybe 50 yards across. In the center stood what could only be described as an altar, a massive stone slab covered in thick moss and strange symbols carved deep into its surface. The symbols seemed to move in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into patterns that made my head ache. Around the base of the altar, arranged in perfect spirals, were bones. Lots of bones. Some old and yellowed, others still bearing traces of flesh and sinew. Fresh ones. Hanging from a branch directly above the altar, swaying gently in air that felt completely still, was Lara's necklace, a simple silver chain with a small cross that caught what little light filtered through the canopy. No body. No blood. Just that necklace, moving back and forth like a pendulum. Jamie took a step toward the clearing, raising his camera. We need to document this. Get pictures for the report. No, I said, grabbing his arm. We need to get out of here. Now. But it was already too late. Something moved in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. We both heard it, branches snapping, soft footsteps circling the perimeter. Not random movement, but deliberate, calculated. Something was moving around us in a wide circle, staying just out of sight among the twisted trees. Jamie raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the perpetual twilight. Who's there? This is Park Service. Identify yourself. No answer came back, but the footsteps continued, getting closer. Then, from all around us, came the whispering. It started soft, barely audible, like wind through leaves. But there was no wind, and the trees weren't moving. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, creating a chorus of voices speaking in that same unknown language we'd heard over the radio. Sometimes I could almost make out words, familiar sounds that my brain tried desperately to interpret as English. But whenever I focused on any single voice, it would fade away, leaving only the incomprehensible murmur of the others. Jamie stepped closer to the altar, his training overriding his fear. Look at these symbols, Cole. They're not Native American, not Celtic, not anything I recognize from the cultural surveys. He pulled out his field notebook, starting to sketch. These carvings look fresh. Some of them are still bleeding sap. Jamie, I said urgently, we have to go. Right now. He stopped. His flashlight beam had frozen on the trunk of a massive pine at the far edge of the clearing. A face stared back at us. No, not a face. A carving. Human-like, but grotesquely distorted. The mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with too many teeth. The eyes were hollow pits that seemed to go on forever. The proportions were all wrong, as if whoever or whatever had carved it didn't quite understand human anatomy. But the worst part was that the carving was fresh. Sap still oozed from the deep grooves, running down the bark like tears or blood. Then a branch broke somewhere behind us. We spun around, weapons drawn. Through the trees, barely visible in the gloom, shapes moved. Tall, thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. They stayed just outside the range of our lights, but I could see glimpses, pale skin that looked almost bark-like, limbs that bent at impossible angles, heads that turned too far on their necks. Jamie aimed his gun into the darkness and shouted, "Show yourself." Last warning. The shapes froze. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then, from directly behind me, came that laugh again. I turned and caught a glimpse of something that made my mind recoil. A tall figure, impossibly thin, with joints that bent the wrong way. Its skin was pale and mottled, like tree bark that had been stripped and left to rot. It didn't walk normally. Instead, it moved in jerky, puppet-like motions, snapping from position to position with unnatural speed. Its face was almost human. Almost. But the eyes were too large, too black, and when it smiled, I saw far too many teeth arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. Then it was gone, vanished between one blink and the next, as if it had never been there at all. Jamie fired his pistol. Once, twice, 3 times. The gunshots echoed through the forest, impossibly loud after the oppressive silence. Nothing. No cry of pain. No sound of a body falling. Not even the rustle of disturbed underbrush. The shapes in the trees had disappeared too, leaving us alone in the clearing with the altar and that gently swaying necklace. Jamie turned to me, his face streaked with sweat despite the cold air. "We need to move." "No. Before they come back, we ran. We didn't bother trying to track our original trail. We didn't care about proper hiking protocol or staying on marked paths. We just ran, crashing through the undergrowth like panicked animals, hoping to find high ground or a ranger station or anything that represented safety and sanity. But the Mornwood Forest didn't want to let us go. The trees seemed to shift around us as we ran, paths we'd just taken disappearing behind us like they'd never existed. Our compasses spun wildly, pointing to magnetic north 1 second, and then somewhere completely different the next. The forest itself seemed to be rearranging around us, creating a maze that had no exit. And the worst part, the whispering never stopped. It followed us through the trees, always just at the edge of hearing. Sometimes it sounded like Lara's voice calling for help. Other times it was Jamie's voice or mine or voices of people I'd known years ago. All of them pleading, warning, laughing that horrible inhuman laugh. Like the forest was inside our heads, picking through our memories, using our own thoughts against us. By the 4th hour, we lost all sense of direction, time, and reality itself. Our GPS units had died first, not drained batteries, but completely dead, their screen showing nothing but static-filled patterns that hurt to look at. Our compasses had become useless, spinning like children's tops or pointing steadily towards some impossible direction that didn't exist on any earthly map. The sun had vanished entirely, though whether it had set or been swallowed by the increasingly thick canopy was impossible to tell. The light filtering through the leaves had turned this weird, bruised color, purple and gold and sickly green, like the sky during a tornado warning. We were being hunted. I was certain of it now. Every few minutes, we'd catch glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision. Tall shapes keeping pace with us through the trees, always staying just out of direct sight. Sometimes they looked human. Other times, they resembled nothing that should exist in our world. They moved wrong, too fluid, too fast, like they weren't bound by the same physical laws that governed everything else. Jamie kept trying to radio, his voice growing more desperate with each attempt. "Dispatch, come in. This is Ranger Jamie Rodriguez, badge number 7794, requesting immediate emergency evacuation from Mornwood Sector 39G. We have a missing hiker situation that's become complicated." Static. Then for half a second, a voice that sounded exactly like Jamie's own came through the speaker. "It wears your face when you're not looking." He dropped the radio like it had burst into flames, staring at it as it tumbled into the moss-covered ground. "What the hell does that mean?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because something was walking parallel to us through the trees, matching our pace exactly. We couldn't see it clearly. The forest was too thick, the light too dim. But the sound was there, constant and deliberate. The crunch of leaves under heavy feet, the soft snap of twigs, the whisper of branches being pushed aside. Just outside our vision, always exactly 20 feet away, something large was moving through the undergrowth with perfect synchronization to our own movements. When we stopped, it stopped. When we sped up, it sped up. When we changed direction, it changed direction. And that laughter kept coming in waves, closer, then farther, then right behind us, then ahead of us. Sometimes it seemed to come from underground, vibrating up through the soles of our boots. Other times it drifted down from the canopy like falling leaves. Cole, Jamie said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think we're not just in its territory anymore. What do you mean? I think we're inside it. I knew what he meant. The forest didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like an organism. A living thing that had swallowed us whole and was slowly digesting us, breaking down our sanity bit by bit until there was nothing left but fear and confusion. We came to what looked like a ridge, a steep drop-off that disappeared into fog. But the fog wasn't normal either. It moved with purpose, rolling uphill toward us in thick tendrils that seemed to reach out like fingers. I've been working in mountain forests for over a decade, and I'd never seen fog behave like that. We didn't have a choice. Behind us, the sounds of our pursuers were getting closer. Ahead, the fog offered at least the possibility of concealment. We climbed down into the mist. In the fog, our world shrank to maybe 5 feet in any direction. Every shadow became a potential threat. Every branch looked like reaching claws. The silence was absolute. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the fog was absorbing sound itself. That's when Jamie said something that chilled me deeper than any of the sounds or smells or impossible sights we'd encountered. Cole, do you remember what Laura looked like? I stopped walking. What? Her face. Laura Mendes, the missing hiker. Do you remember what she looked like? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't. I remembered everything else. The report on my desk. Her car at the ranger station. Her planned route marked on the trail map. The note she'd left, written in careful block letters. Her backpack hanging from that tree like a grotesque ornament. But I couldn't picture her face. Not even vaguely. It was like the memory had been surgically removed from my brain, leaving only a blank space where her image should have been. Jamie looked pale as death in the swirling mist. It's doing something to us, taking our memories or thoughts, piece by piece. I felt sick, like something was crawling around inside my skull, chewing through my memories with tiny, sharp teeth. How much of myself had I already lost? How much of what I thought I knew was real? We stumbled through the fog-shrouded forest, deeper into a nightmare that seemed to have no bottom. At one point, I thought I saw my childhood dog, Rex, a golden retriever who'd been my constant companion until I was 15. He was standing on the trail ahead of us, tail wagging, looking exactly as he had 20 years ago. But his eyes were wrong, black and empty, and when he opened his mouth to bark, only that horrible laughter came out. Jamie saw his grandfather, his abuelo, who taught him to fish and hunt in these very mountains. The old man stood between two twisted pines, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd been buried in, his mouth moving in what looked like Spanish but produced only that incomprehensible whispering. The forest was using our own memories as weapons, pulling familiar faces from our past and twisting them into instruments of terror. It wanted to break us down, make us doubt everything we thought we knew about reality. But we kept moving, clinging to each other like drowning men. Hours passed. Could have been more. Time felt broken, unreliable. Sometimes I'd check my watch and find that an hour had passed in what felt like minutes. Other times, what seemed like miles of walking had only taken us through a few seconds of clock time. We were caught in some kind of temporal loop, walking through a forest that existed outside normal space and time. And then, just when I thought we might collapse from exhaustion and fear, we came to a cabin. It squatted in the mist like a diseased animal, Old logs darkened with age and moisture, windows boarded up with planks that looked like they'd been torn from other buildings. The roof sagged in the middle, heavy with moss and decay. Vines had grown over most of the structure, giving it the appearance of something that was being slowly digested by the forest itself. There's no way it should have been there. No way it could be on any official map. The Mornwood sector had been thoroughly surveyed, every structure cataloged and marked. But here it was, impossible and undeniable. The front door stood open, darkness yawning beyond the threshold like a mouth. Despite every survival instinct screaming at us to keep running, the cabin felt like sanctuary. After hours of being hunted through an impossible forest, even this decrepit structure represented shelter, walls between us and whatever was stalking us through the trees. We approached carefully, weapons drawn. The temperature dropped noticeably as we got closer, not gradually, but all at once, like stepping into a refrigerator. Our breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well preserved. A single room with log walls, a stone fireplace filled with cold ashes, and a few pieces of furniture that looked like they'd been carefully maintained despite the exterior decay. In the center of the room sat a rough wooden table with a single chair pushed up to it. On the table was a journal. Jamie picked it up with trembling hands, flipping through the pages. "Cole." His voice was barely a whisper. "This is written in my handwriting." I looked over his shoulder. He was right. The neat, careful script was identical to Jamie's field reports, right down to the way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. "I've never seen this before," he said, his voice shaking. "I've never been in this cabin. I've never written any of this." But there it was, page after page of entries in his own hand, describing everything we'd experienced. The dead birds at the sector boundary, the destroyed campsite, the altar in the clearing, even the phrase from the radio transmission, "It wears your face when you're not looking." The handwriting was perfect. The details were exact. But Jamie had never written a word of it. And then pages we hadn't lived yet. Jamie read aloud, his voice getting quieter with each word. Day 4 found the feeding ground. Lara's body was there, along with dozens of others, all arranged in spiral patterns around the root systems. The thing doesn't just kill. It cultivates. It farms. He flipped ahead, scanning entries that described our future, or a possible future. His hands shook as he read silently, his face growing paler with each page. "What does it say?" I asked. "One ranger dies in the cabin. The other escapes, but..." He looked up at me. "But it follows him home. It spreads beyond the forest." The journal was dated 3 days from now. We should have run. Should have fled that cursed place and never looked back. But neither of us could move. Something heavy pressed down on our chests, making it hard to breathe. The air in the cabin had thickened, becoming viscous, like trying to breathe through honey. The floorboards began to groan under an unseen weight. And then, from the open doorway behind us, came a voice I recognized. "You shouldn't have come here." It was my voice. Exactly my voice, speaking my words. We turned around. Standing in the doorway was a figure wearing my face. Not just resembling me, wearing my face like a mask. Same uniform, same build, same scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But the eyes were wrong. Too wide, too still, too knowing. And when it moved, the motions were slightly off, like someone learning to operate an unfamiliar body. Jamie backed away, raising his weapon. "What the hell are you?" The thing tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve. The movement was accompanied by a soft cracking sound, like breaking twigs. Then it spoke, using Jamie's voice instead of mine. "W, what the hell are you?" The mimicry was perfect. Not just the words, but Jamie's exact intonation, his slight stutter when he was nervous, even the way his voice cracked on the final syllable. I drew my sidearm, trying to keep it steady despite my shaking hands. "Back off. Whatever you are, just back off." The thing wearing my face smiled. The expression was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. It took a step into the cabin, and I noticed it didn't make any sound when its feet hit the floor. "Shoot it," Jamie whispered. I aimed at the center of its chest, but hesitated. It looked so much like me that my brain couldn't process it as a target. Some deep, primitive part of my mind was screaming that I was about to shoot myself. The thing noticed my hesitation and smiled wider. That's when I realized there were two Jamies in the room. The real one was behind me, pressed against the back wall. The one next to the door was imposter, identical in every way except for those horrible, unblinking eyes. "Shoot it," the real Jamie shouted. "Which one?" I asked, swinging my gun between them. Both Jamies pointed at each other and said in perfect unison, "That one's not me." I couldn't tell the difference. They were both perfect copies, down to the smallest detail. Same uniform, same stubble, same small scar on the chin from a climbing accident last summer. Even their fears seemed genuine. Then one of them, I couldn't tell which, stepped forward. "Cole, it's me. Jamie, look at my eyes. You know me." I stared into his face, searching for something, anything, that would tell me which was real. That's when I noticed it. The one by the door wasn't breathing. His chest wasn't moving at all. I fired. The bullet hit its center mass, and the thing let out a shriek that shattered every window in the cabin. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of screams, dozens of voices crying out in agony and rage. The sound was so loud and horrible that it felt like needles being driven into my eardrums. Then the thing began to dissolve. Not fall, not collapse, dissolve. Its form wavered like heat shimmer, then began to break apart into wisps of shadow and mist. The last thing to disappear was its face. My face, still wearing that too wide smile. It sank through the floorboards like smoke and was gone. Jamie, the real Jamie, collapsed into the chair, breathing hard. "It was wearing your face. Perfectly. How did you know?" "It wasn't breathing," I said. "And its eyes never blinked. We didn't sleep that night. We couldn't." Every shadow in the cabin seemed to move. Every creak of the settling logs sounded like footsteps. And worst of all, we could hear things outside, voices calling to us in the darkness. Sometimes they sounded like fellow rangers requesting backup. Other times like lost hikers begging for help. Once, I could have sworn I heard my mother calling my name, though she'd been dead for 5 years. We stayed in that cabin until what we hoped was dawn, though the light outside never seemed to get any brighter. It just went from black to dark gray, like the sun was shining through layers of smoke. When we finally worked up the courage to leave, we found a trail behind the cabin that we'd somehow missed the night before. It was wider than the paths we'd been following, clearly marked with wooden posts and metal blazes. A real trail leading somewhere specific. But the footprints in the soft earth weren't for hiking boots. They were barefoot. Human-shaped but wrong, just like the ones we'd found at Lara's campsite. And they were fresh. We followed them because we didn't have any other choice. The forest around the cabin had changed overnight. The trees now formed an impenetrable wall except for this one path. It was follow the trail or stay trapped in that horrible place forever. The prints led us through increasingly strange terrain. The trees became larger, older, more twisted. Some of them had grown together, their trunks fusing into impossible shapes that hurt to look at. Others had branches that seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them, reaching out like grasping fingers. After what felt like hours of walking, we crested a small hill and saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A ranger station. But it wasn't ours. It wasn't any station I'd ever seen. The building was identical to the Thornwick Ranger Station where we'd started this nightmare, but everything was wrong. The wood was older, weathered gray instead of brown. The windows were boarded up from the inside. And the sign out front, which should have read Shadowmere Cascade National Forest, instead said something in that same unknown language we'd been hearing whispered through the trees. Inside, we found the source of our doom. Two skeletons in ranger uniforms, laid out carefully on metal cots. Their arms were folded over their chests, hands clasped like they were sleeping peacefully. But bones don't arrange themselves. Someone or something had posed them. One of the skeletons wore a badge with Jamie's name on it. The other wore mine. The skeletons had been there for years. That much was obvious from the condition of the bones, yellowed with age, covered in a fine layer of dust and moss. But they weren't hidden or buried. They were displayed like museum pieces, arranged with careful precision on twin cots that looked like they'd been moved specifically for this purpose. The skeleton wearing Jamie's badge still had fragments of fabric clinging to its ribs, the remains of a ranger uniform identical to the one he was wearing now. Around its neck hung a radio, the plastic housing cracked and faded but still recognizable as Park Service equipment. One of them still had a journal clutched in its bony fingers. Jamie reached toward it, but I grabbed his shoulder hard enough to bruise. Don't. Why not? Because I think we've already read it. His face went pale as understanding dawned. You think this already happened? I nodded, staring at the impossible scene before us. Or it's happening again, and again, and again. Time wasn't linear in this place. Cause and effect had no meaning in the Mornwood depths. You could walk forward and end up behind yourself, live through events that had already killed you, meet your own corpse in a building that shouldn't exist. Jamie backed away from the bodies, his breathing rapid and shallow. We need to go. We need to find high ground, a clearing, anything that gets us out of this hellscape. We exited the Phantom Ranger station and stepped into a sky that belonged to no world I'd ever seen. There was no sun, just a dull, pulsing red light that seemed to bleed through clouds the color of old bruises. The light itself felt wrong, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The trees had changed too, grown impossibly tall and twisted, their bark black as charcoal and veined with something that glowed faintly purple in the crimson twilight. Some of the trunks had faces carved into them, not the crude markings we'd seen earlier, but detailed human faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. And worse than any of this, the forest was breathing. Not metaphorically. I could hear it, feel it, the rhythmic expansion and contraction of something vast and alive. The mist that perpetually shrouded the ground rose and fell in perfect synchronization with the sound of massive lungs filling and emptying. Each exhale brought with it that smell of rot and metal and funeral flowers. Jamie turned to me, his eyes wide with a kind of primal understanding. We're not just in its territory, Cole. What do you mean? We're inside it. The whole forest, it's one organism. And we're in its stomach. The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. The Mornwood wasn't just haunted or cursed. It was alive. A single, impossibly vast entity that had been feeding on lost souls for decades, maybe centuries. The trees were its nervous system, the fog its digestive juices, the strange sounds its thoughts made audible. And we were being slowly broken down, absorbed, added to its collection of memories and experiences. Something moved ahead of us, a shape that defied description. Sometimes it looked like a man walking upright. Other times it resembled a massive spider, all legs and angles. Once, for just a moment, it appeared to be nothing more than a void in the shape of a human body, a walking absence that consumed light itself. It stepped forward, emerging from the twisted trees, and became me, perfect in every detail. Same posture, same equipment, same exhausted expression I could feel on my own face. When it spoke, it used my exact voice, complete with the slight hoarseness I developed from hours of fear and screaming. You've been here before, Cole. Jamie raised his gun without hesitation this time. Don't listen to it, Cole. Whatever it says, it's lying. But I couldn't help myself. The thing looked into my eyes with my own face, and I felt a terrible recognition. Like looking into a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your future. I was you, it said, tilting its head in a gesture I recognized from my own mannerisms. Before you were born. And I'll be you after you're gone. Every ranger who's ever walked into these woods becomes part of me. Your memories, your experiences, your face, all mine now. I aimed my weapon at my own face, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the gun steady. You're not real. You're just some kind of parasite feeding on fear. The thing wearing my identity smiled. My smile, but stretched too wide, showing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. I'm more real than you are. You're already fading, Cole. Look at your hands. I looked down. My hands were becoming translucent. I could see the forest floor through my palms, watch my own flesh slowly disappearing like morning mist. You are, it continued, but not for long. Soon you'll just be another memory in my collection. Another face I can wear when I need to lure fresh prey into my domain. It smiled again, and this time I heard the sound of wood creaking, as if its face were made of old timber. Jamie opened fire. The bullets passed through the thing like it was made of smoke. It didn't flinch, didn't react at all, except to stop smiling. You shouldn't have done that, it whispered, and its voice echoed from every tree in the forest. The trees began screaming. Not groaning or creaking, screaming. Long, wailing shrieks that sounded like dozens of human voices crying out in agony. The carved faces in the bark opened their mouths and added their voices to the chorus, a symphony of suffering that made my bones ache and my vision blur. The ground beneath our feet started to convulse, great roots tearing free from the soil like the tentacles of some buried kraken. The purple veins in the tree bark pulsed brighter, pumping some kind of luminous fluid through the forest's circulatory system. We ran. But running in the Mornwood wasn't like running anywhere else. Distance had no meaning. We could sprint for what felt like miles and find ourselves back where we started. Paths appeared and disappeared beneath our feet. The forest rearranged itself around us, trapping us in an ever-shifting maze of nightmare vegetation. Eventually, gasping and exhausted, we reached what looked like a cliff. Below us stretched an ocean of black mist, so thick it looked solid enough to walk on. But within that darkness, things moved, shapes that might have been trees or buildings or massive creatures swimming through the fog like whales through deep water. And rising from the mist were those same glowing veins we'd seen in the trees, but enormous, pulsing with bioluminescent fluid as they stretched up toward the blood-red sky. Jamie gasped and pointed. Cole looked. Below us, barely visible in the churning mist, were figures. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. All running, falling, dying, screaming. All trapped in endless loops of terror and confusion. Some wore modern hiking gear. Others were dressed in clothes from decades past, wool coats and leather boots that spoke of earlier eras. A few looked like they might be wearing the buckskins and furs of the mountain men who'd first explored these peaks 2 centuries ago. All of them were us. Different versions, different iterations, but unmistakably us. I could see my own face repeated dozens of times in the crowd below, each one frozen in a different moment of horror. Jamie's features appeared just as frequently, twisted by fear and desperation. How long has this been going on? Jamie whispered. Forever, I said. It's been going on forever. The thing that wore my face stepped up behind us. We didn't turn around. We could feel its presence like cold breath on our necks. You can go, it said, using my voice but speaking to both of us. Leave the forest. Return to your normal lives. Forget this ever happened. Jamie glanced at me, hope flickering in his eyes despite everything we'd seen. What's the catch? The thing's voice shifted, becoming something that sounded like multiple people speaking in unison. No catch. Just a simple trade. Leave me one of your faces, and I'll let the other go free. I looked at Jamie, saw my own desperate desire for escape reflected in his expression. After everything we'd been through, the offer was almost unbearably tempting. To walk away from this nightmare, to pretend none of it had ever happened. It's lying, I said, though part of me desperately wanted to believe otherwise. Maybe, Jamie replied. But what if it's not? What if one of us could actually get out of here? The thing extended what looked like my own hand toward us. Choose quickly. My patience isn't infinite, and there are other rangers entering my domain as we speak. Fresh faces to collect. Jamie took a step forward, his hand reaching out. Then he stopped. No, he said firmly. I won't give it anything. Not my face, not my memories, not my soul. He turned to me, his expression resolved. Whatever happens, we face it together. Then he jumped off the cliff. For a moment, he hung suspended in the air, silhouetted against the red sky. Then he plummeted into the mist below, disappearing among all the other lost souls. Gone. No scream. No sound of impact. Just, the thing wearing my face looked at me with what might have been disappointment. Why did you let him do that? It asked. Because he made the right choice, I said. And what choice will you make? I looked down at the churning sea of lost souls, then back at the creature that had been hunting us through this impossible forest. For a moment, I saw past its disguise, glimpsed the true thing beneath, something ancient and hungry and utterly alien, wearing human faces like trophies. The same one he did. I turned and ran, not toward the cliff, away from it, deeper into the nightmare forest. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until the screaming trees became a blur of motion and sound around me. I ran until reality itself seemed to break apart, until I crashed through barriers that felt like spider webs made of light and shadow. And suddenly, I was slamming into the wooden gates of a ranger station. A real ranger station. The Thornwick station, exactly as I remembered it. It was morning. Birds were singing in the trees, normal birds, making normal sounds. The sun was shining through a clear blue sky, and the air smelled of pine needles and fresh mountain air instead of rotten metal. My truck was parked exactly where I'd left it. But according to my phone, it wasn't the same day we'd entered the forest. It wasn't even the same year. The date read April 6, 2029. I've been gone for 3 years. But I looked exactly the same. I felt the same. As far as my body was concerned, only a few hours had passed since Jamie and I had first entered the Mornwood sector to look for a missing hiker named Laura Mendez. They eventually let me return to work, but it took months of evaluations, assessments, and carefully monitored reintegration sessions. The official story was comprehensive and believable. Ranger Cole Morrison had suffered a complete psychological break while investigating a missing person case in the remote Mornwood sector. He'd been found 3 days later, dehydrated and delirious, babbling about impossible forests and shape-shifting entities. Classic wilderness-induced psychosis, complicated by severe dehydration and hypothermia. The psychiatrist had neat labels for everything: traumatic amnesia, dissociative fugue state, acute stress reaction with psychotic features. They gave me medication that made my thoughts feel wrapped in cotton, and they scheduled regular sessions where they asked careful questions about my delusions and false memories. But there were problems with their neat little narrative. Problems they couldn't explain away. Like the fact that I'd been found not 3 miles from the ranger station, but nearly 200 miles away, in a part of the forest that didn't exist on any map. The search teams had discovered me unconscious in a clearing that the GPS coordinates insisted was solid granite mountainside. Like the fact that my equipment, radio, GPS, compass, had been subjected to some kind of electromagnetic interference so severe that the electronics were permanently fried. The metal components showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, though I had no burns on my body. Like the fact that Jamie Rodriguez had never existed. No employment records. No personnel file. No one at any of the ranger stations in the Shadowmere Cascade Range had ever heard of him. The background check showed no one by that name had ever worked for the Park Service, not just in our district, but anywhere in the entire system. When I insisted that he'd been my partner for 2 years, they showed me my duty rosters. Every patrol, every shift, every incident report had my name on it. Only my name. I've been working alone the entire time. But I remembered him. I could describe his face, his voice, his mannerisms. I knew about his grandfather who taught him to fish, about the scar on his chin from a climbing accident, about the way he hummed under his breath when he was nervous. None of it had ever been real. Sometimes, Dr. Hendricks explained during one of our sessions, the mind creates companions during periods of extreme stress or isolation. It's a survival mechanism, the brain's way of maintaining social connection when faced with unbearable loneliness. But if Jamie had been a hallucination, who had written in that journal? Who had fired the gun I'd heard in the clearing? Whose voice had been on the radio? They didn't have answers for those questions. Just more medication and sympathetic nods. They transferred me to Whispering Pines National Recreation Area in Idaho, a small, safe place with well-maintained trails and weekend campers. No old-growth forest. No unmarked sectors. No tree lines that seemed to watch you with unseen eyes. But every now and then, I felt it. That silence. That pressure in the air that meant something was watching, waiting, hunting. It usually happened during the night shifts, when I was alone in the ranger station updating logs or monitoring radio traffic. The normal sounds of the forest would fade away. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, no wind through the pines. Just that oppressive quiet that I remembered from the Mornwood depths. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, my radio would crackle to life with transmissions that shouldn't exist. Voices calling for help from coordinates that led to empty wilderness. Missing person reports for hikers who'd never been registered at any park entrance. And once, just once, a voice that sounded exactly like mine saying, "You can't run from yourself forever, Cole." I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange incident, every impossible occurrence. But when I'd check it the next day, the pages would be blank, as if I'd never written anything at all. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in October. I was doing my weekly supply run in the small town of Cedar Falls, picking up groceries and equipment at the local outfitters. Normal routine, normal day, nothing out of the ordinary. Until I saw him at the end of the cereal aisle. Same height as me. Same build. Same ranger uniform. He was reaching for a box of granola, moving with familiar gestures that I recognized because they were mine. When he turned around, I was looking at my own face. Not similar. Not resembling. Exactly my face, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow and the slight asymmetry of my nose where I'd broken it in college. We locked eyes for maybe 2 seconds. He smiled. My smile, but wrong somehow, too knowing, too satisfied, and then stepped backward around the corner of the aisle. I ran after him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The aisle was empty. I searched the entire store, checking every row, every corner, even the stockroom and employee areas. The staff thought I was having some kind of medical emergency, which, in a way, I suppose I was. The security cameras showed nothing. According to the digital footage, I've been alone in the cereal aisle the entire time, talking to empty air and then running through the store like a madman. But I knew what I'd seen. That thing from the forest, it had followed me. Somehow, despite my escape, despite the hundreds of miles and 3 years that separated me from the Mornwood, it had found me. And it was still wearing my face. I don't sleep much anymore. When I do, I dream of twisted trees and impossible forests, of Jamie falling into an ocean of mist, of my own face smiling at me from dark windows. Every morning, I check the mirror carefully, looking for signs that my reflection might act independently. So far, it hasn't. But I know it's only a matter of time, because I understand now what that thing in the forest really was. Not just a predator or a parasite, but something far worse, collector. It gathers faces, memories, identities, adding them to its ever-growing repertoire of human disguises. And once it has your face, it has a piece of your soul. The real question isn't whether it followed me out of the Mornwood. The real question is whether I ever left at all. Maybe I'm still there, trapped in that nightmare forest, living through endless variations of the same terrible story. Maybe this normal life is just another layer of the dream, another maze within the maze. Maybe the man I saw in the grocery store was the real Cole Morrison, and I'm just one of the thing's collected faces walking around in the world, thinking I'm human. I don't know anymore. I can't trust my own memories, my own perceptions. The boundaries between reality and nightmare have become so blurred that I'm not sure they ever existed at all. So if you ever find yourself hiking in the deep woods, especially the parts that aren't on any official map, the places where the trees grow too thick and the silence feels too heavy, listen carefully. If you hear laughter, that doesn't sound quite human. If you see your own face reflected in dark water where your face shouldn't be. If you encounter a ranger who looks familiar but somehow wrong, run. Don't stop to investigate. Don't try to help. Don't look back, because some things that live in the forest are older than the trees themselves. They've been collecting faces for centuries, gathering identities like trophies, wearing human masks to lure new prey into their domain. And once they have your face, they have a piece of your soul. Once they know what you look like, they can be you anywhere, anytime. They can follow you home. They can take your place. They can make everyone forget you ever existed. So run if you can. But remember, in the deep woods, where reality bends and time loops back on itself, sometimes running just brings you back to where you started. Sometimes the only way out is to become part of the collection. Sometimes the thing you're running from is yourself. And sometimes late at night when the forest is too quiet and the shadows move wrong, I wonder if I'm still in there. Still trapped. Still being hunted. Still becoming something else, one stolen memory at a time. The thing in the Shadowmere depths is patient. It has all the time in the world. And it's always hungry.